Welcome to Relax Story, a place where gentle stories help you leave behind the noise of the day and slowly drift into a peaceful sleep. Each soft, soothing narration is designed to relax your mind, release tension, and guide you to a deeper sense of calm within. If you enjoy the experience, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay with Relax Story every night, and feel free to leave a comment to share your thoughts or suggest a story you'd love to hear. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let Relax Story guide you into a restful deep sleep. Before any story was ever told, before even the idea of existence could take shape, the universe lay in a state beyond naming, where there was no form, no light, and no sound. There was no sky to cover, no earth to support, no ocean to reflect, and no boundary to divide above from below, light from dark, or near from far. Everything stretched outward like an endless openness, where nothing moved, where time did not pass, and where there was no way to know that time had ever been. It was not darkness. Darkness still requires light to stand in contrast. This state came before both, a silence without comparison, an emptiness without edge. There was no beginning, and there was no end. Only a presence yet to be shaped. Within that stillness, an ancient notion began to emerge, not as a clear call, but as a slight opening within the boundless void itself. Chaos. Chaos was not disorder as later ages would come to understand it. It was not conflict, nor violent motion, but a primordial openness, a formless abyss where all possibilities might arise. There was no center, no direction, no boundary to contain or divide anything. Chaos did not hold the world. It was the ground from which the world could begin. From that openness, the first principles slowly appeared, not as beings, but as layers of reality quietly separating from the original indeterminacy. Gaia came first, not merely as earth, but as the first foundation that could be touched, a firmness spreading through a space that had never known support. With her presence came the idea of stability, of a place where things could rest, could stand, could begin. Beneath that foundation, a depth opened. Tartarus emerged as a bottomless abyss, a darkness stretching endlessly downward, where anything could fall without ever reaching an end. If Gaia was the surface, then Tartarus was the depth. If Gaia held, Tartarus released. For the first time, the world had above and below, though nothing yet stood between them. Then another force stirred, unseen, untouchable, yet spreading like a first pulse. Eros. Not love as later stories would tell it, but a quiet pull, a binding force that drew what was separate toward one another. It was this force that made life possible, that allowed generations to follow one another, that kept stillness from remaining absolute. When these four came to exist together, the original void was no longer entirely undefined. Space had taken on a form, though still faint. A ground had taken shape. A depth had opened. An unseen force began to weave between all distances. For the first time, the universe could be imagined. There was no explosion, no burst of light tearing through darkness, only a change so slow, so gentle, it could scarcely be perceived. From nothingness, a quiet foundation emerged. From emptiness, a silent depth unfolded. From stillness, a subtle force began to spread. And in that moment, Witnessed by none, the universe found its own rhythm, a breath, faint and fragile, yet enough to carry existence forward. As the ground settled into being and the void was no longer wholly empty, another presence began to take shape, a covering that would close the space above. Gaia was no longer alone. A first sky awaited its arrival. Gaia continued to expand, no longer a vague notion drifting through emptiness, but becoming a vast plain, silent yet steadfast, as though existence itself had found a place to rest. Layers of earth emerged, not with noise, not in haste, but spreading quietly in a way so natural the change could scarcely be noticed. This ground was not merely a place to stand, but the first foundation, where all later forms would rise, grow, and fade according to their own cycles. A below had come into being, clear, stable, perceptible, imaginable. Above remained empty. The world, at this moment, was like a story that had begun, yet still lacked its other half. From the stillness of that ground, another presence formed, not separate, but drawn from the same essence, rising upward to cover all that lay beneath. Uranus appeared, not as a distinct figure, but as a vast unseen dome lowering itself, enclosing Gaia in an endless embrace. For the first time, space held two clear directions, below and above, the tangible and the all-encompassing. The earth lay still, the sky stretched wide, two opposing presences bound within a single, complete structure. The world gained height, and with it, existence was no longer a silent plain, but a space that could expand, could shelter, could contain what had never been before. From that union, Gaia continued to shift, no longer remaining a flat expanse, but raising portions of herself into uneven forms, lifting land into mountains, lowering it into chasms, shaping the first contours of the world. The aura rose like folds of the earth itself, silent yet heavy, as though the land were remembering its own form. At the same time, Pontus spread outward, not in violence, not in turmoil, but as a deep expanse in constant, gentle motion. The mountains held stillness, the sea carried movement, high and low, still and shifting, all wove together, transforming the world from a simple surface into a layered expanse, capable of change, of containment, of growth. A form had begun to emerge, clearer, fuller, more complex. Within a space that now held earth and sky, height and depth, an inevitable union began to take place. Gaia and Uranus did not merely exist side by side, but came together in a way that felt written into the structure of the world itself. From this union, the first beings of defined form were born, no longer abstract principles, but entities with power, with roles, with presence. The 12 Titans came into being, each bearing a fragment of the vast cosmos. The 3 Cyclopes emerged, their single gaze focused, as though the forces of nature had been drawn into a single point. The 3 Hecatonkaias rose with countless arms, countless motions, like a storm yet unnamed. The world was no longer empty. It began to fill, slowly, with forces alive, distinct and immeasurable. Each group existed in its own way, separate, unlike the others, yet all shared a common origin. The Titans carried the weight of great laws, slow, enduring, Nearly unchanging, the Cyclops suggested concentrated power, like fire, like thunder, like energies hidden beneath a quiet surface. The Ekatoncheiras embodied excess, power overflowing beyond all bounds, difficult to restrain, impossible to predict. This diversity didn't bring balance at once. It made the world denser, more complex, less certain. Where many forces exist together, the possibility of collision begins, even if it has not yet been named. Uranus looked upon what had been born from his union, and instead of expansion, he sensed something else, faint yet undeniable. The power of his children was not entirely within his control. The possibility of being replaced was no longer unthinkable. A quiet fear took root, not erupting into action at once, but enough to alter the way he beheld the world. From that fear, a decision slowly formed. The beings newly born would not be allowed to step into the light. They were held back, forced downward, imprisoned within the very earth that had brought them forth. Gaia felt it, not as thought, but as a growing weight within herself. What should have expanded was held back. What should have grown was halted. The space that had been opening began to tighten, as though an unseen force pressed everything inward. Life still existed, but not freely. Presence remained, but could not reveal itself. A fracture, small but real, formed within what had seemed complete. From that moment, the world was no longer merely a place where life was born. It became a place that held, that restrained, where great forces were compelled into silence. Conflict had not yet erupted, but it was there. Like a current beneath still water, power had appeared, so had fear. And when both exist together, a pattern begins to take shape, slowly yet surely, as though it had always been waiting. The world had form, it had generations, it had power, and within all of it, a subtle unrest began to spread, unseen, yet undeniable. When that weight can no longer remain hidden, when silence can no longer contain what gathers beneath it, another movement will begin. An intention will take form, and from it, an act will rise, one strong enough to change how sky and earth exist together. The sky had spread itself across the face of the earth, a vast vault enclosing every newborn form where Gaia lay beneath, heavy and silent, while Uranus stretched above, filling all space with an unbroken presence. Between them, the first world had taken on shapes that could be recognized. Mountains rising from the deep body of the land, seas unfolding into shifting depths, and the first beings carrying within them a primordial force. And yet beneath that seeming stability, something was not permitted to unfold fully. Life had emerged, but it was not allowed to grow. The children of Gaia did not step into the light, did not spread themselves into the space that should have been theirs, but were held back in a hidden darkness, as though the sky itself had pressed down to prevent all expansion. Uranus saw in them no future, only a silent threat, and that fear compelled him to hold them fast, forcing them back into Gaia herself, where existence became a prolonged pressure with no release. Gaia was no longer merely the ground of the world, but a vast body that gathered within it all that was restrained, burdened with a weight that could not be eased. Space had taken form, yet peace had not. The sky did not uphold, but pressed downward. The earth did not open, but was held shut. Life did not spread, but was confined within the very place of its birth. An unseen fracture appeared within what seemed stable, a slight deviation, yet deep enough to alter the entire course of the tale. From that moment, creation no longer stood alone. It began to carry within it a response. When the weight endured beyond what could be borne in silence, Gaia did not merely suffer. She began to conceive of change. In the depth of her stillness, she formed an intention, not loud, not hurried, but sharp as a line already destined to be drawn. From her own being, she shaped an object, curved, hard, and keen, a sickle that was not only a tool, but a possibility, an opening into what had never before occurred. She called to her children, each a bearer of primordial strength, the Titans born from the union of earth and sky. The call did not resound as a command, but spread as an acknowledgement that what existed could no longer remain unchanged. All heard it, but not all answered. Only one stepped forth from that silence, Cronus, the youngest, not the strongest, nor the most radiant, yet the only one willing to take action. He did not rise as a savior, but emerged as a cold movement, a decision that required no explanation. In him there was no hesitation, only a quiet accord with what must come to pass. When the design had taken shape, the world seemed to slow. There was no warning, no sign of a storm to come, only a moment drawing near, little by little, as though it had always existed, waiting for its appointed hour to reveal itself. Uranus returned, as he always had, laying himself upon Gaia, covering and holding the world within an unchanging presence. Yet this time, beneath that familiarity, something else was waiting. Cronus concealed himself in the darkness, the curved blade in his hand, unmoving, unwavering. When the moment reached the point beyond return, he struck. There was no violent clash, no eruption of chaos, only a single motion, decisive, cold, and irreversible. The sickle traced its arc through space, and in that instant, the sky no longer held its place. Uranus was severed from Gaia, no longer pressing upon the earth, and between them, for the first time, a space was opened. That distance was not vast, yet it was enough to change all things. Space began to breathe. What had been confined could begin to move. The new order was not yet complete, yet its foundation had appeared, not from construction, but from a cut. But the change did not end there. From the wounded sky, drops of blood fell upon Gaia, sinking into the earth like seeds bearing another meaning. From them arose new beings, not born of peace, but of the very rupture that had just occurred. The Erinyes emerged, bearing unrelenting pursuit. The giants rose as masses of raw force, and other forms followed, making the world not lighter, but denser. What remained of Uranus fell into the sea, where water and motion merged, spreading a white foam across the waves. From it, another form appeared, softer, brighter, like a reflection opposite to the violence that had brought it forth. Beauty emerged from the place of the wound, not erasing the past, but existing alongside it, as another layer of meaning within the same event. Thus, the world did not merely change the bearer of power, it changed the way of existence itself. From compression, it shifted into openness, yet not into peace. What had occurred did not vanish. It remained, as a mark that could not be undone. Uranus no longer held the highest place. Cronus rose to claim the power severed from the ancient sky. The Titans entered their age, bearing new strength and new roles within an order newly formed. Yet beneath that transition, something else endured in silence. Power was no longer something fixed. It had revealed that it could be taken, replaced, repeated. The son could rise against the father. The father could become what he once opposed. A circle had begun to close, not swiftly, not clearly, yet enough to be seen. The silence after the upheaval did not carry triumph. It felt like a void opened after a great motion, where the world seemed lighter, yet more hollow. The cosmos had learned to breathe, yet in its first breath, it also learned that every structure bears within it the possibility of fracture. Uranus had departed from his place. Cronus held the power born from rupture. Yet with that passing, something else began to form, indistinct, unhurried, yet unavoidable. For once a sun has risen, that image never fades from the memory of power. After the sky was torn from the earth, the world entered a new age, wider, higher, as though it might at last rest within the order newly set. Cronus, the youngest son who once lay hidden in the shadow of the Earth Mother, now rose to the highest place, holding the power that had belonged to Uranus. From that moment, the cosmos no longer bore the shape of compression. The space between sky and earth had opened. Mountains stood more firmly. Seas breathed more deeply. Even the darkness in the deep crevices was no longer the darkness of absolute confinement. All seemed to have settled. Yet it was only a stillness upon the surface. Beneath that ancient and immense presence, the age of the Titans revealed itself like a lake after a storm, calm above, yet holding its tremors in the depths. Power had changed hands, but unease had never departed. Cronus sat upon his throne as though upon a summit raised from a fracture. He had overthrown his father. He had opened a new reign. He had set his name at the center of the world. Yet even as power settled into place, the shadow of collapse began to form. Faint at first, then slowly lengthening like evening shadow upon stone. Beside him stood Rhea, his sister, a Titan bearing the deep gentleness of the earth, of birth, of all that comes quietly yet endures. Their union was not merely of divine blood, but a bridge between the old generation and the one yet to come. In such a world, union did not merely form a family, it formed the future. It opened new bloodlines. It called unseen destinies toward the light. And there, the prophecy arose. It did not come like lightning. It did not cry out. It did not burn. It came far more quietly, like a truth that had always lain within the world from the moment Cronus raised the sickle against his father. One day, one of his own children would do the same. It was no accident of fate. It was a circle already closed, a seed sown within the very act of usurpation. Cronus had once been the son who rose against his father. Thus the throne he had claimed was no longer a prize of victory but a seat of fear. From that moment, the Titan reign no longer belonged wholly to stability. It belonged to waiting, to vigilance, to a repetition drawing ever nearer, slow, yet never ceasing. Then the first children were born. Each time Rhea gave birth, the world should have expanded once more. A new flame should have been kindled, a new harvest named, a new power shaped, a new domain entrusted. Life should have spread like dawn across the mountainside. Yet in the hands of Cronus, every beginning was bent into an ending. Hestia was born, yet the flame of the hearth was extinguished before it could rise. Demeter was born, yet the seed of the fields never reached its season. Hera was born, yet the form of sovereign queenship never found its voice. Hades and Poseidon followed, yet the depths of shadow and sea had no one to name them. Each child, each destiny, each fragment of the world's future was held back within the body of their father. This was not merely cruelty, it was a rhythm. Born, devoured, silence returns. Born, devoured, darkness closes. Born, devoured, the future delayed. It was that rhythm which made the tale colder than any blade. Violence no longer bore the form of eruption. It became habit. It became reflex. It became the silent clock of fate, steady and terrible. Cronus believed that by keeping his children within himself, he could keep his throne unmoved. He believed that if the future were never allowed into the light, the prophecy would fade like an echo with no answer. But prophecy does not die that way. It grows within resistance. Rhea bore witness to that entire cycle. She was not merely the consort of the Titan King. She was the mother who watched each of her children vanish the moment they touched life. That pain did not erupt into cries. It sank deeper, heavier, quieter, like water seeping through stone, day after day, unseen yet unstoppable. Within her, loss was no longer a series of moments. It became a long sorrow, thin as mist, yet covering the whole of the reign. The greatest tragedy lay in this Cronus had once known what it was to be oppressed. He had been the child of a father who feared his own offspring. He had stood in rebellion. He had borne his mother's sickle to carve a path toward freedom. Yet when power came into his hands, he did not break the old law. He stepped into the place of the one who had wounded him. As though every throne learns the same language, as though power, once haunted by the fear of loss, remakes itself in the image of what it once sought to destroy. Thus the fracture within Cronus's reign did not begin with an outer war. It began within, with the first child devoured, with the first birth turned into loss, with a throne that was no longer a seat of rule, but a watchtower guarding an unending dread. Each child held back did not dim the prophecy. It made it sharper, nearer, more real. The fear Cronus sought to bury in darkness became the force eroding his power, little by little, like salt wearing into the foot of an ancient cliff. When the first 5 children had vanished into that silence, something within Rhea could no longer endure as before. No thunder sounded, no vow was cast into the sky, only a small, deep, resolute shift within the heart of a mother, from endurance to decision, from grief to will, from silence to secrecy. 5 children had been lost. The prophecy remained unchanged, unweakened. As the 6th child prepared to draw its first cry, Rhea understood that the cycle would not end on its own. Between the fear of a king and the quiet grief of a mother, a hidden path began to open. It did not lead at once to victory. It did not blaze with light. It led into secrecy, held close in shadow, and carried slowly toward a distant island beyond the reach of the Titan throne. Crete was waiting, as though the world itself knew that every cycle, however enduring, must one day reveal a narrow passage through which fate may pass. After the first 5 children of Rhea vanished one by one into the body of Cronus, the world seemed to sink into a heavy stillness, a silence that did not bring peace, but instead made fear more visible. Outwardly, the throne of the Titan still stood firm. Power remained in the hands of the one who had overthrown his own father, and sky and earth continued to hold the shape of a new order. Yet beneath that order, a fracture had opened long before. Each time a child was born and then lost, that reign surrendered a measure of its calm, as though it were being eaten away from within by the very thing it struggled to prevent. Cronus sought to swallow the future so that the present might remain unmoving. Rhea understood that some things, the tighter they are held, the faster they slip away. At the final birth, when the 6th child was about to cry for the first time, a secret began to take form within the heart of the world. It did not arrive as thunder, nor blaze forth as a sign of triumph. It was only a small intention, quiet, concealed like a spark held within 2 closed hands. At the centre of power lay control, vigilance, a restlessness that never slept, and far beyond the Titan King's sight, a hope thin as morning mist was being prepared. At times, the greatest changes do not begin with sound, but with something very small, very hidden, almost unseen. The place that sheltered this secret was Crete, an island set apart from the old centre of power like a silent breath of the earth itself. In ancient tradition, the child was brought to a cave upon that island, sometimes linked to Mount Dicte, sometimes to Ida, yet, whatever the name, the place appears as a secluded hollow among stone, wind, and shadow. Not a palace, not a great hall, not a place touched by the gaze of authority, only a cool chamber of rock, a primal shelter of earth where life could withdraw and grow unnoticed. From that moment, Crete was no longer merely a place. It became a cradle veiled in mist, holding the future within the cave. The child was nurtured by Amalthea, sometimes told as a sacred goat offering the first milk of life, sometimes remembered as a gentle goddess tending a fragile being. The differing tellings do not blur the essence of the story, for all move toward the same image: a child with no power yet, no lightning in his grasp, no storm at his command, sheltered by the quiet tenderness of mountain and shadow. Around him stood guardians who struck shield and weapon to drown the sound of his crying, so that that fragile voice would not cross the stone and reach the ears of Cronus. Thus the place bore no splendour of a dynasty. It held instead the stillness of a seed beneath the earth, waiting for its season to awaken. Elsewhere, across that distance, Rhea did what none had done before. When the child was born, she did not place him into the hands of Cronus as she had 5 times before. She gave her husband a stone wrapped in cloth like a newborn infant. Cronus swallowed it in his familiar vigilance, believing he had sealed away yet another threat. That moment needed no cry of celebration. It was quiet, precise, and almost desperate. A mother had used patience to resist prophecy, and cunning to open the first narrow crack in a wall thought unbreakable. The meaning of that moment lay deeper than the act of deception itself. Until then, prophecy had hung like a shadow over generations of gods, vast and cold, none escaping it. Now, For the first time, that shadow shifted, not by overwhelming force, but by a quiet resolve. Zeus at that time was still only an unnamed child in a cave on Crete. He had not yet changed the world. He had only been allowed to remain within it. Yet sometimes, the mere survival of one life is enough for the fate of an entire dynasty to begin turning in another direction. Zeus grew beyond the sight of his father. He did not grow among thrones, nor beneath vaulted halls of power. He grew among stone and shadow, with the echo of metal ringing like the heartbeat of a guarded secret. Those years needed no miracles to adorn them. It was the quiet that mattered most. Cronus knew nothing of that final child, could neither control nor consume him, and while the Titan king believed he had locked the future within his own body, at the edge of the old world, that future was quietly learning how to endure. Zeus did not appear as a flame bursting into the night. He was like a small ember kept alive within ash, smouldering, enduring, until the day it could become lightning. From here, the breath of the story changes. The heaviness remains, yet within it a thin line of light has begun to form. The world does not change at once. Cronus still holds his throne. Yet another order has begun to take root where the old power cannot see. Dynasties often believe they fall because of forces that arrive from outside. In truth, change often grows for a long time in the darkness they have forgotten to watch. And when Zeus came of age, the secret could no longer remain within the cave. He returned, no longer the child hidden in the mountain's heart, but one who carried the power to unseal what had been buried. Cronus, who once devoured his children to preserve his rule, was at last forced to return what he had taken from the future. Hestia emerged like a warmth that had never truly faded. Demeter returned like a harvest held too long in silence. Hera came forth with the dignity of a sovereignty not yet named. Hades and Poseidon also stepped out from the swallowed darkness, as though the deep realms of the world has been restored to their rightful keepers. From that moment, the tone of myth itself shifted. The fear of a single king was no longer its centre. A new generation had risen, not from loud triumph, but from the restoration of what had seemed entirely lost. What remained was not a blazing victory. It resembled the first moment of dawn, when the sky still holds its old grey, yet light has begun to touch the edge of the mountains. The new order was not yet complete. It had only just awakened. Zeus was no longer the child lying still in a cradle of stone, nor could Cronus continue to believe that the future could be kept forever in darkness. As the siblings returned to their forms and places, the world approached the threshold of a confrontation greater than any before. This time, fate would not move in secrecy. It would unfold beneath the sky, upon the earth, and across the ancient powers preparing to call each other's names in the trembling of the whole universe. After Zeus escaped the fate that had consumed the 5 children before him, grew in secrecy, and forced Cronus to release the siblings held in darkness, the world could no longer confine that fracture within a single divine family. From that moment, every silent grievance, every delayed prophecy, every cycle between father and son gathered into a great movement. The confrontation took the shape of a war spread across the entire cosmos. The sky was no longer a quiet dome. The earth was no longer a motionless foundation. Even the space between height and depth seemed drawn taut, as if the world itself held its breath before the hour of reckoning. What began as inherited fear now expanded into a greater question: who would define the order of all that exists beneath the sky, upon the earth, and below the abyss? Here, the story left the tragedy of bloodline and entered the War of Ages. Such a war could not rest on lineage or inheritance alone. Zeus understood that to shift that ancient balance, he must awaken powers long buried since the dawn of the world. In the coldest depths of Tartarus, where darkness lay thick as stone and time itself seemed nearly still, there remained beings whom Uranus had once feared. The Cyclops and the Ekatonchires, children born of earth and sky, carried within them a power too raw, too violent, too close to the primal pulse of the universe. Long before, they had been cast down into the depths for the very strength they possessed. Zeus descended there not only to seek allies, but to open a part of the past that earlier reigns had always sought to seal. When their chains were broken, it was as though an ancient darkness cracked with them. The Cyclops emerged like walking furnaces, bearing the heat of metal, of celestial fire, of lightning not yet formed. It was they who would place into Zeus's hand the weapon suited to the place he sought the thunderbolt, not the gentle light of dawn, but a force that could tear the sky into pale, burning fractures. The Ekatonchires were even more terrible in their vastness, 100 arms like 100 storms, 50 heads like 50 moving peaks. They did not appear as an army, but as a catastrophe of nature newly awakened. From that moment, the war was no longer a struggle between Zeus and Cronus alone. It became the hour when the most ancient powers of the world were forced to choose their side. From the place long sealed, the boundary between the old age and the new began to shine like a line of light against the dark sky. The two sides rose to face one another not only in strength, but in the meaning of existence they embodied. On Cronus's side stood the Titans, beings heavy as ancient mountains, old as the first memory of stone, born when the world had not yet learned to breathe softly. Their power bore the weight of origin, vast, rough, and compressed. On Zeus's side stood a younger generation of gods, more fluid, clearer, carrying within them an order still forming, not yet hardened. One belonged to what had long been, the other to what was coming. One held the world within the orbit of old power, the other sought to give the future a different shape. The war was not merely to decide who was stronger. It would determine what form the world itself would take. In some traditions, the Titans stood with Mount Othrys, while Zeus's side was bound to Olympus. The image holds its beauty in turning mountains into symbols, peak against peak, ancient stone against new sky. The universe did not erupt in a single instant. It leaned slowly into war, like rising tides, like clouds gathering before a storm that could no longer be avoided. The war endured for 10 years. These years should not be imagined as a chain of constant blows, but as a storm with memory, each day layering upon the next, each night flowing into another, never leaving, only changing form. In the sky, Zeus's lightning tore again and again through dense clouds, leaving sharp flashes that vanished into deeper darkness. Beneath the earth, tremors surged through mountains and stone, through foundations once thought immovable. Tartarus below seemed called upon again and again, opening wider, waiting for the fallen. The battlefield was not a field nor a gate. It stretched across every layer of the world, The sky shook, the earth split, mountains echoed, the abyss held the final reverberation. In that vastness, the Cyclops forged celestial fire into lightning, while the Ekatonchia hurled their strength like a hailstorm from a primordial age. No single strike decided it all. No single moment could close 10 years. The balance shifted only gradually. Like an evening shadow creeping along stone, with each bolt, Zeus's power shone brighter. With each sweeping arm, the weight of the Titans wore thinner. The war was so vast that the universe itself seemed forced to choose the order in which it would awaken. When the final storm at last subsided, the world did not return to what it had been. It opened its eyes into another form, stranger, clearer, and further from its origin. Cronus at last was defeated. The one who had raised the sickle against his father, who had devoured his children to delay prophecy, could no longer prevent the cycle of power from turning upon himself. That fall bore no triumphant noise. It was colder than that, quieter than that. It resembled the moment when an ancient pillar finally cracks beneath the weight of the very history it once upheld. The Titans were overcome one by one, their reign closed, while Zeus and his siblings rose to the center. The meaning of this turning lay in the collapse of the old pattern of power, built upon fear of loss and the devouring of the future, proving at last that it could not endure. Another order began to appear, no longer merely the rule of the strongest, but a world that could be divided, governed, and held in clearer balance. From this point, Zeus was no longer the hidden child of a distant cave. He became the new convergence of the high sky, where power no longer belonged to the past, but passed fully into another age. Yet a new order can only stand when the old one is cast out from the center of the world. The defeated Titans were hurled into Tartarus, into the depth beneath all light, where darkness was no longer the veil of secrecy, but the seal of finality. That gate did not merely imprison the fallen, it closed an entire age. The Hekatonchires, once chained in that abyss, now stood as its wardens. The image carried a quiet completeness. The powers once buried deepest now rose to lock the old world into the deepest place of the cosmos. From then on, the shadow of the Titans no longer lay across the sky. Space itself seemed to widen after years of compression. The air felt lighter after a storm that had seemed without end. That release was not loud, nor radiant, nor like a rising joy. It was like a sky finally clearing after 10 years of thunder, when the light is not yet warm, but enough to show mountain, sea, and the silent edge of the abyss. The war had passed. Cronus and the Titans had fallen into the deepest depths, yet that victory had only cleared the space for a far more difficult task to shape the universe anew after the storm. The sky required a new sovereign, the sea another hand. The depths too needed a ruler suited to their darkness. After all the ruin, the three brothers now stood before an act that no longer belonged to war, but to the remaking of the world itself. After the last remnants of the Titan Age had been cast down into the abyss, the universe entered, for the first time, a silence vast enough to hear itself. The heavens no longer roared with collision. The earth no longer trembled beneath the weight of defiance between father and son. Far below, Tartarus closed like an ancient stone gate, sealing away what remained of the old order where no light could reach. Nothing had yet become gentle, but it had ceased to be torn apart. After a storm too long endured, the world did not rejoice. It simply breathed slower, deeper, as though existence itself required a moment to recover. It was within that stillness that power began to change its shape. No longer a blow struck from fear, no longer a sickle cutting through darkness, nor a war vast enough to shake both sky and abyss. Power now revealed itself in another form, quieter, colder, clearer. It revealed itself through division, not to seize the world once more, but to place the world where it belonged. Before a universe newly drawn out of chaos, the three sons of Cronus and Rhea rose like the first pillars of a new age: Zeus, Poseidon, Hades. 3 names, 3 natures, 3 vast domains that would henceforth bear the mark of their rulers. In earlier generations, power had always come with oppression, with devouring, with the dread of being overthrown. But in this moment, for the first time since the dawn of the world, the great realms of existence were named through allotment, not conquest. The sky had its sovereign, the sea had its sovereign, the deep realm of the dead had its sovereign. The new order didn't banish darkness entirely, but it began to set its boundaries, to limit its force, to give form to a world that had long existed only through successive ruin. Zeus took the sky, the highest vault of the cosmos, where light passes before it touches the earth, where clouds gather and dissolve, where rain falls upon the fields, where thunder cleaves the air like lines of fire inscribing power itself. In his hands, the sky was no longer a dome pressed low upon the world as in the earliest age. It became a vast expanse, high, luminous, ever in motion, yet still encompassing all. From that height, every shift in weather carried meaning beyond itself. A cloud was no longer merely a cloud. Rain was no longer merely water. Thunder was no longer merely sound. They were signs that supreme power had found its place, its voice, its domain. Zeus thus did not merely hold the space above the other gods, he held the summit of order itself, where all could be seen, where light met judgment, where power took the shape of law. Yet the world could not be complete with height alone. It required a realm that moved, that surged and withdrew, that embraced the shore and shattered stillness in the same breath. That realm belonged to Poseidon. When the sea fell to him, the universe gained a breadth filled with breath and uncertainty. The sea did not stand still like a throne. It lived as a vast body. It drew inward in silence. It swelled in fury. It carried the paths of journeys not yet begun, while concealing within itself depths beyond measure. Poseidon was not merely lord of waters. He was master of all movement in its primal form of that which nourishes and threatens, reveals and conceals. If Zeus's sky was power seen from above, then Poseidon's sea was power spread in all directions, touching the shore, retreating, and returning once more. Through his dominion, the world learned not only to stand, but to tremble, to sway, to hold within itself a force that never truly rests. Beneath sky and sea, deeper than any tide, darker than any twilight, another realm awaited its name. Hades took the world below the domain of those who had crossed the final boundary of life. It was not a place of blazing judgment, as later imagined, but a kingdom apart, silent, distant from light, where every final step must lead. There, life was no longer measured by harvests or deeds, but by endings, by memory, by the shadow that remained once breath had gone. Hades ruled not in fury, but as keeper of the final gate of order. Through him, the universe became whole. Above lay the sky. Around lay the sea and the lands of the living. Below lay the realm of those who had departed the light. The world no longer stretched only across breadth, it rose in depth. Layer upon layer, like an ancient structure at last given foundation, roof and corridors descending into shadow. When the great realms had found their masters, a centre began to emerge through the mist of the new age. Olympus rose not as a mountain alone, but as a convergence long awaited by the cosmos. After generations of wandering power of strife and collapse, the gods now had a place to gather, a summit upon which to stand, a space near the heavens yet apart from the turmoil below. Upon Olympus, the throne of Zeus was not merely a king's seat. It was the sign that divine power had found its centre, its return, its enduring form. The mountain bore a meaning greater than its stone and snow. It was the first dwelling of the new order. It marked the end of endless upheaval. It was the place where divinity would no longer merely be strong, but structured, measured between above and below, between centre and distant edge. From that moment, the ancient Greek world ceased to be only a chain of wounds passed from father to son. It became a structure that had risen after many falls. Zeus held the sky, Poseidon held the sea, Hades held the realm of the dead. Olympus stood as the heart of the divine. Each realm bore a nature, each nature a god, each god an irreplaceable role. From this frame of power, all later stories would unfold. The gods would take on names and forms. Humanity would enter their history with fragile fate. Heroes would rise, struggle, love, fall, and be remembered. Yet before all of that, the world required a moment to be set in its place. That moment lies here in the stillness after war, in a division no longer stained by the chaos of beginnings, in the rare sense that the universe, after a long passage through darkness, had at last found a way to stand upon itself. Since chaos first opened the void, never had the world appeared so clear. It had height, it had depth, it had a centre. Thus a new age did not arrive with thunder, but with the solemn quiet of all things restored to their rightful place. When sky, sea, and the realm of death had each found their lord, the life of the gods was no longer merely a history of struggle. It began to take on its own rhythm, its own order, its own faces soon to step forth from the light of Olympus, carrying their names, powers, and fates into the vast world below. Once the sky belonged to a god, the sea had its master, and the abyss had withdrawn to its proper depth. The Greek divine world reached the moment it required a centre, not a centre of battle, nor of prophecy awaiting fulfillment, but a centre of stability. Olympus appeared in that role high above the earth, clearer than any other peak, removed from the heavy dust of the world, standing almost beyond the reach of change that still flowed through mortal life. There, the air seemed purer, the light more still, and time no longer moved to the hurried rhythm of birth, hunger, and war. If earlier ages had been shaped by collision and ruin, this place was shaped by arrangement. Olympus was no longer merely a height of earth and sky. It became the place where power ceased to clash in darkness and began to take its seat. At its centre stood Zeus, the axis of the new order, no longer the hidden child concealed in stone, nor merely the son who overcame his father in war. He became the point around which all movement turned. The sky was his, yet his meaning extended beyond it. From his throne, thunder was no longer a weapon to overthrow an old reign. It became the sign that the world had a guardian of its boundaries. The lightning in Zeus's hand bore not only force, but affirmation, like a seal of light upon the order of the cosmos. On Olympus, he stood as a king who kept all things in their place. He no longer needed war to prove his power. His presence alone shaped the mountain into a court of the universe, where each god existed not as a solitary flame, but as part of a greater fire burning steady and whole. Around that centre emerged the first quiet rhythms of divine life, gentler, steadier, enduring. Hera brought to Olympus the sense of ritual, of marriage, of sovereignty shaped by form. Beside Zeus, she transformed power from something solitary into something structured, bearing dignity and the shadow of divine royalty. Demeter brought another dimension, quiet, essential. With her came the scent of earth, of seed, of harvest ripening beneath a distant sun. Through her presence, Olympus touched not only the heights, but the fields below, the granaries, the slow growth of life. Hestia held a smaller, deeper light, not the lightning across the sky, nor the distant brilliance of the heavens, but the fire at the centre of the home, silent, constant, unseen yet indispensable. Hera upheld form, Demeter sustained life, Hestia preserved continuity. Through them, Olympus gained warmth, breath, and the sense of a structure made whole. From this foundation, newer faces of the divine order emerged, distinct aspects of the world itself. Athena stood among the clearest forms of this new Olympus: wisdom, strategy, craft, reason joined with strength. She was not the uncontrolled force of a storm, but a sharp and lucid light. Born from the very centre of power, a sign that the new order was not only strong, but mindful. Apollo brought another light, broader, resonant. In him lay the brilliance of spiritual order, of prophecy, of art, of all that gives the world not only existence but meaning. Artemis stood beside him like the shade of deep forest beside morning light, keeper of the wild, of the hunt, of purity, of the boundary between the civilized and the untamed. Together, Athena, Apollo, and Artemis lifted Olympus beyond a place of rule. It became a place where mind, light, and nature each found their voice. Yet no order is complete with light alone. It must also hold the heavier forces, those nearer to sweat, conflict, and motion. Ares stood as the echo of war, not to plunge Olympus into chaos, but to remind that conflict remains part of the world. Here, however, war had a name, a boundary, a place within the divine structure. Hephaestus brought fire in another form, not lightning, but forge fire, glowing metal, the labour of shaping matter. Amid Olympus's purity, his presence rang like a distant hammer that never ceased, reminding that even gods require craft and creation. Hermes was movement among all these cross and thresholds, boundaries, paths of gods, men, and the dead. He was the swift step of message, the bridge between heights and the rest of the cosmos. Through Ares, Hephaestus, and Hermes, Olympus ceased to be a still palace. It became a living body, strength, labour, passage, and constant exchange between realms. Thus, For the first time in Greek myth, the divine world stood clear and firm. The gods were no longer scattered forces rising from primordial shadow, nor merely figures seen through endless struggle. They had a dwelling, a centre, a role, a rhythm. Zeus held the height, Hera held the dignity of order, Demeter held growth, Hestia held the central flame, Athena, Apollo, and Artemis opened the realms of mind, light, and nature. Ares, Hephaestus. Hermes preserved war, craft, and movement within the whole. Olympus was no longer merely a place where gods resided. It became the slow-beating heart of Greek myth, a source from which stories of mankind, love, fire, harvest, war, and heroes would flow downward like hidden streams from a mountain crowned in light. And when that order had settled, another question rose from beneath those clear heights. The gods had found their place, their fire, their law, their dominion. What, then, would be given to humankind smaller, briefer, more fragile within this ordered world? At that thin boundary between divine and mortal, a name was about to emerge from the shadow of the old age, bearing an act powerful enough to shake even Olympus, though it seemed so still. When the heights of Olympus had settled into their place above, when thunder and lightning had found their master, when the deep sea, the wide earth, and the shadowed realm below had all been named within a new order, beneath that splendour there still endured a small and fragile race, like a seed of life not yet strong enough to stand before the world. Humanity was there, yet its presence trembled, as damp soil before the early wind. They walked beneath the open sky without truly belonging to it, lived upon the earth without knowing how to shape it into a lasting shelter. Night fell, and darkness spread over all things like a heavy cloth without a tear. Cold slipped into the flesh. Beasts, bitter winds, hunger, fear, all drew nearer where no spark of light held them at the edge. The world of men knew no forge lit with flame, no warm meal rising fragrant in the night, no heat kept within the frail coverings they called shelter. Their hands could touch the earth, yet did not know how to press it into enduring form. They could see trees and stone, yet had no means to compel nature to yield them a clearer space to live. Their existence was like an unfinished sentence, a shape moulded but not yet given what it needed to complete itself. It was within that quiet lack that Prometheus appeared, not as a distant figure standing above, but as one who beheld the deepest emptiness within the fate of mankind. Prometheus was a Titan, yet there was something in him unlike the ancient heaviness of powers born at the beginning. He was bound to foresight, to a kind of wisdom that saw not only what was, but what had yet to come, where many gods looked upon the world as an order to be preserved. Prometheus seemed to look upon mankind as something unfinished. He did not see in them only frail creatures bound to accept a fixed fate. He saw a form incomplete, a race standing before a threshold without the key to cross it. And so his closeness to humanity did not lie in simple pity. It lay in the understanding that if left forever in that primal darkness, mankind would remain like wild grass beneath great mountains, born and gone without ever truly entering its own history. Deeper still within the tale, between Prometheus and Zeus there had long been a fracture, and the fire was only the moment that made it plain. In the rites of sacrifice, Prometheus had once used cunning to deny Zeus the finer share, This was not merely a trick among gods, but the first sign that he did not wholly accept how the new power had arranged the place of mortals in the world. Zeus saw order as something to be held by the strongest hand. Prometheus saw that same order and recognized that at its lowest tier, mankind was kept in want. When Zeus concealed fire from humanity, it was no longer a passing anger. It became a deliberate closing of a gate, a reminder that certain powers must remain beyond the reach of mortals. From that point, the story did not turn toward loud confrontation. It shifted almost imperceptibly, yet enough to alter the course of what would come. Prometheus stood within the order of Olympus, yet his heart leaned toward those who could not yet protect themselves. That divergence was not like a rebellion of clamour. It was like a hidden current changing course beneath the earth, slow, deep, unseen, yet once turned. Nothing remained quite the same. Prometheus understood that fire was not merely something withheld, it was a boundary. Whoever held fire held the power to transform the world. And so he took that hidden light from the hands of the immortals and carried it back to the earth. Outwardly, it was but the theft of a spark, yet within the depth of myth, it was the moment mankind crossed an ancient threshold. Fire was first warmth against the cold of night, a small red glow that kept human hands from utter helplessness before the dark. Then it became hearth, ember, metal flowing beneath patient hands. It changed the nature of food, reshaped stone and ore, brought forth tools from what had once lain silent within the ground. It allowed mankind not only to endure, but to begin shaping the world around them. Within that flame were craft and knowledge, memory and the first dim vision of cities not yet raised. There was the sharpening of blades, the closing of doors against the wind, the thought of ships that one day would leave the shore, the first questions asked beneath a trembling golden light. Fire didn't only illuminate the human face, it revealed the thought that mortals could create more than what nature had given. From a race that endured, they began to learn to transform. From a passive life, they began to carry within themselves the power of choice. That was the deepest gift Prometheus bestowed. Yet in Greek myth, any gift that alters fate carries with it a shadow of punishment. Zeus did not overlook this defiance. Prometheus was bound to stone, fastened to his torment as a harsh reminder that supreme power does not suffer challenge without cost. There, his body became the place where pain returned again and again, with each day, each cycle, each dawn that opened and closed. That punishment was not for a Titan alone. It was the price of standing with mankind when mankind was not yet strong enough to guard the gift it had received. As for mortals, the fire opened two paths at once. One led toward civilization, the other toward the burden of awareness. With fire, men learned to warm themselves, to cook, to forge, to make the night less endless. Yet with fire, they also entered a life no longer untouched. Labour became clearer. Craft was born alongside ambition. Choice brought consequence. Knowledge did not only grant power, but also the awareness of loss, of error, of things that could not be undone once named. From then on, mankind was no longer wholly subject to the gods, yet no longer innocent as it had been when it knew only how to exist. Thus the tale does not end as a song of triumph. It leaves behind a deeper, quieter echo. Prometheus gave mankind the fire, yet what was opened was not only light, it was a long path of labour, creation, hope, and sorrow. From that moment on, the world of men could not return to what it had been. A door had been opened, a price had been accepted. From the first ash that stirred in the dark, civilization began to move, and from that same spark, the shadow of unease began to grow. Zeus did not forget, nor did Olympus. If fire was the gift that allowed mankind to stand more firmly within the world, then what would follow bore a different beauty, softer upon the surface, yet within it lay the seed of trial. It would not come as thunder, but as something alluring placed within mortal reach, and from there, the first sorrows would enter human life bearing a face more radiant than flame itself. After the first fire was brought down to mankind, the earth no longer held the same cold stillness as before. In places where only deep night and clinging mist had once settled upon stone, a red glow began to tremble, small yet enduring, like a heartbeat newly awakened within the breast of the world. From that moment, men learned to warm their hands against the cold, to soften food with heat, to bend stubborn matter into forms that served their fragile lives. That light opened a new path, slow and distant, yet enough to draw them away from the primal helplessness that had once filled every day. Yet within the ancient order of the gods, every gift carries its shadow. Fire did not only light the huts and the rocks, it also sharpened the gaze that watched from above. As mankind stepped away from its first blindness, its fate grew fragile in another way, as though the very moment of touching warmth brought it nearer to loss. Tragedy did not descend like thunder. It did not crash like a storm at sea. It entered life with steps almost soundless, so light that only when all had changed did mankind realize the old world had already slipped away. It was within that quiet turning that a new form was made, not to heal, not to redeem, only to ensure that the world would never again be as it had been. She came as a gift shaped by many divine hands, each placing within her a quality, a beauty, a charm beyond naming. From earth and form, from gentleness and grace, from a clear gaze to a quiet allure, she was brought into the world as something never seen before. In a world still rough and unformed, where mankind had only just learned to keep fire through the night, her presence must have seemed like a strange dawn falling among days still heavy with cold ash. She did not bear the face of calamity. She bore the face of new beauty, of grace, of something the human heart would readily open to receive. Her tragedy lay there. She did not enter the tale with malice. She was placed within a design greater than herself, like a petal set upon water, unaware of the current beneath. When she was sent to the house of Prometheus, the gift already carried within it a closed fate. Though warnings had been spoken, though doubt had once passed like a shadow, human hands still open to receive that beauty. There are things in the world that come not because they are sought, but because they have long been set in motion, quiet as winter growing within a day still lit by sun. With her came another thing, far quieter, far more concealed, yet heavy with the dark weight of destiny. A great jar, a vessel that revealed nothing upon its surface. It did not shine, did not sound, did not take a form that stirred fear. It simply stood there, ordinary as any object set in the corner of a dwelling, silent enough to be forgotten. And it was that very ordinariness that deepened the sorrow of the tale. The misfortune of mankind was not hidden in claw or blade. It rested within a sealed vessel, close to daily life, so unremarkable that none would think the world could change from so small a gesture. Then the moment came, without thunder, without violence, without the face of war, only the lifting of a lid, a single movement, brief, private, almost without thought. Yet from that opening, what had been confined began to escape and spread across the earth. Suffering came first, sickness followed, weariness, anxiety, fear, loss, nameless grief, sleepless nights, days of toil without rest, all drifted forth like a dark smoke that could not be gathered back. They did not fall once and end. They scattered into life itself, entering every home, every body, every season of sowing, every passing year of humankind. From that moment, the world was no longer whole as it had been in the first age of fire. Before, mankind was weak yet unaware of the fractures that would wound its days. After, it lived within a reality divided, one side warmed by light, the other shadowed by the cost of stepping out of darkness. The sorrow of this tale does not arise from open hatred. It comes from a gesture that cannot be undone, from the fragile curiosity of a being who stands within fate as all others do. Thus the sadness of Pandora is not sharp like a blade. It is quieter, like a cold that seeps into stone at dusk, slow, yet beyond all restraint. When nearly all the evils had fled, one thing remained at the bottom of the jar. Hope lingered there, not as a blazing torch, but as a small presence held within the dark, silent, fragile, uncertain whether it was comfort or delay. It did not rise with the others. It was left behind, enclosed, as though from that moment onward, mankind would always live between what causes pain and what allows it to go on. Thus, after Pandora, hope was no longer something freely given like wind or morning light. It became something to be kept, to be sought, to be guarded within days that had come to know hardship and loss. So the tale does not only say that suffering entered the world, it says that from then on, human life would always bear two layers at once, one of sickness, anxiety, toil, and the unavoidable, the other, the ability to endure, to carry within a small light not wholly extinguished. It is not a perfect consolation. It is what remains after an irreversible change. Perhaps that is why the fate of mankind deepens from this point, grows more sorrowful, yet more enduring. For once darkness truly enters life, even the faintest light becomes something more precious than any treasure. From then onward, mankind possessed fire to warm the long night, suffering to understand its own fragility, and hope as what remained after all else was lost. Above, in the still heights, the order of the gods continued to unfold through new bonds, where love, jealousy, union, and birth began to weave together like hidden streams beneath Olympus. Power no longer stood alone. It began to bear the face of feeling, of relationship, of ties that would draw the divine and the mortal ever closer. Upon the heights of Olympus, where bright clouds drift slowly about sacred halls and daylight seems never to fade, the gods made their dwelling in a realm suspended far enough from the dust of mortal earth, yet near enough to witness every subtle change unfolding below. There, Zeus held the highest place, as the sky holds its own vastness expansive, all-encompassing, bearing in his grasp the thunderbolt, the law, and sovereign power. At his side stood Hera, queen of the gods, embodiment of marriage, of rightful order, of the enduring bonds that preserve both household and lineage. These two figures stood at the heart of Olympus not merely as divine husband and wife, but as the twin poles of a sacred order from which all connections began to spread outward, touching other deities, reaching down to mortals, and quietly altering the course of the world itself. Thus Olympus was never a silent summit where immortals sat untouched by unrest. It resembled a sacred court more than an unchanging heaven, where every union carried an echo, every birth wove a new thread into the vast tapestry of fate, and every jealousy or wound could extend beyond the private sphere to become a matter of heaven and earth alike. Within that space, love did not stand apart from power, bloodlines were not severed from order, and desire did not escape consequence. All things were bound together soft as thread, yet enduring as ancient vows. From that very centre, the first stirring spread outward, not as great noise, but as the faintest ripples upon still water. Zeus was the source of many such ripples. In Greek myth, he did not appear as a king seated in stillness upon a throne, enclosed within supreme glory. He was the origin of countless ties, where from a single desire, a meeting, a moment of passion, or a solitary choice, new lineages began to emerge. From him, divine blood extended across Olympus, yet from him also invisible threads reached down to the mortal world, touching human lives and giving rise to children born between realms, neither wholly of heaven nor entirely of earth. They carried within them an unnamed threshold, where the light of divinity mingled with the fragility of human fate. Dionysus bore such a mark, born of the union between Zeus and Semele, carrying from the very beginning the heat of secrecy and the shadow of loss. Perseus too entered the world from the meeting of divine power and mortal fate, growing into a hero who could lay hands upon what ordinary men could only behold with fear. Heracles stood even more vividly, as though the entire web of Olympus had been drawn tight into a single life. Thus Zeus should not be seen as a solitary figure with separate tales of love, but as the central knot within a vast net. Each bond he formed shifted the place of others, brought pain to Hera, stirred Olympus in quiet tremor, and left lasting marks upon the history of heroes. Power, however great, never stands alone. It draws bonds with it, and the deeper those bonds, the longer their consequences endure. Where power spreads, there too arises a counterforce that preserves the memory of hurt. Hera was that force, sister and consort to Zeus, queen of Olympus. She stood as the image of marriage, of a household order, and of the rightful sanctity of union. Her jealousy was not merely the private response of a betrayed wife. It rang like the taut, enduring tension of an order disturbed from within, like a sacred door opened against the vow that once kept it closed. In Greek myth, she often cast her anger not only upon the women Zeus had touched, but upon the children born of those unions. That anger sometimes took the form of calamity, sometimes a shadow that lingered silently over an entire life. Heracles, from his earliest days, lay within that shadow of enmity. Dionysus, though born of a different path, did not escape it either, for the fate that befell Semele marked his origin with sorrow from the beginning. Hera could not sever the web spreading from Zeus, she could only draw it tighter, so that each once gentle thread carried now the ache of injury, of pride, of the longing to be acknowledged. In this, the Greek gods became strangely close to humankind. Beneath the light of immortality, they still knew pain, knew anger, knew abandonment, and knew how to respond to fractures they could not mend by power alone. Perhaps for this reason, Olympus was both sacred and reminiscent of a distant memory of family, where love and wound often grow from the same root. Amid such tensions, another form of power entered, softer, yet no less profound. It was the power of attraction, of beauty, of enchantment that moves the heart before reason can speak. Aphrodite bore that power. She was the goddess of love and beauty, yet the love she embodied was never merely gentle or at rest. It was a pull, a subtle tilting of the heart, something that could draw two destinies together or shift an established order with the lightest tremor. Wherever Aphrodite passed, beauty was never wholly pure, for it always carried allure, urging and entanglement. When Aphrodite stood beside Ares, this became clearer still. Ares belonged to war, to conflict, to the clash of metal amid storms of courage and fear. Aphrodite belonged to desire, to attraction, to the unseen force that alters the course of hearts. One was collision, the other enticement. Yet in Greek myth these currents did not stand apart. From their union came forms both beautiful and uneasy, as though even in love there lingered the echo of battle, and within every passion lay the shadow of tension and unrest. Thus Aphrodite was not a tranquil blossom beyond all turmoil. She was a link that rendered the divine web more supple, more alluring, yet more complex. And Ares remained a reminder that even the fairest bonds may carry a cold resonance from the depths of conflict. From these stirrings, the world did not remain confined to the gods themselves. It continued to bring forth life, to expand, and to descend to earth through children of dual blood. Dionysus stood among the most singular of these. Within him was the divinity of Zeus, the humanity of Semele, the presence of secrecy, of sorrow, of divine intervention in a fragile mortal life. From his origin, he stood upon the threshold between worlds, belonging wholly to neither. He was like a cluster of ripened grapes grown from roots that pierced two layers of soil, holding both the warmth of earth and the intoxication of the immortal realm. Perseus followed that pattern in another way brighter, and marked more clearly with the tone of heroism. Son of Zeus and Danae, he entered life bearing the imprint of divine power upon his fate, and from there became one who dared face Medusa, who stepped through terror to save Andromeda and alter the course of the tale. He proved that from divine connections there arose not only disorder or unrest. At times, they gave rise to those who could touch the structure of the world and shift it through their own deeds. Heracles stood as the image in which that entire web appeared nearly complete. Son of Zeus and Alcmene, he was born at the crossing of divine authority and human life. Yet his life was shaped not only by that origin, but shadowed heavily by Hera. Within a single fate, Zeus appeared as origin, Hera as opposing force, and the mortal realm as the place where all consequences must be lived to their end. Thus Heracles was not merely a mighty hero, he was proof that Greek heroes did not arise by chance, nor from emptiness. They were born from emotional bonds among the gods, carrying within them both the grace and the fracture of Olympus, both light and the fine cracks that never wholly close. By this point, Olympus no longer stood apart above, nor did humankind remain apart below. The two realms had long since touched not through a single rupture, but through countless fine threads woven across time, from Zeus to Hera, from Aphrodite to Ares, and from those ties to Dionysus, Perseus, and Heracles. Greek myth reveals a world without clear boundaries between gods, mortals, and heroes. The gods intervened in human life, and mortals gave rise to figures near enough to the divine to alter the course of legend. Perhaps for this reason, the ancient Greek world was not only filled with tales of gods, but dense with heroic myth, as though between heaven and earth there always existed a middle realm where fate was forged into form. What lingers most deeply does not lie in the power of Zeus, nor in Hera's anger, nor solely in Aphrodite's beauty or the distant clang of Ares. What remains is the sense that these gods were never perfect. They loved, they envied, they were drawn, they were wounded, they reacted, they bore children, and let the consequences fall upon the mortal world like rain upon open fields. It is this imperfection that renders Greek myth at once cosmic and intimately human. From Olympus, the emotions of the gods did not strike like lightning and vanish. They fell more slowly, more softly, like fine threads carried on the wind. In time, it was these very threads that wove a world where gods, mortals, and heroes endlessly crossed one another, leaving behind marks both beautiful and sorrowful. From that intricate web, the tale would gradually settle into a deeper rhythm, where myth no longer unfolds through desire and lineage, but through a quieter law of loss, separation, and return. Upon the earth, all things once appeared in their fullest state. Meadows spread beneath gentle light, wheat still held the pale gold of promise, the soil lay soft as though it breathed, and the wind passed across the fields like an unseen hand brushing over the growing world. There, Persephone appeared in the form of a maiden still close to the dawn of life young, unshadowed, carrying the fragrance of flowers and the softness of a spring that had never known parting. She bent among the fields of Nysa to gather newly opened blossoms, as though the earth itself were weaving garlands beneath her touch. Above that beauty lingered the quiet presence of Demeter, the mother bound to wheat, to cultivated land, to the patient rising of seeds within the earth. Persephone was the bloom of spring just unfolding, while Demeter was the silent depth that allowed all green life to rise. Between them, their bond was never merely that of a divine household. One touched renewal, the other preserved life itself. One was the opening petal, the other the soil that had long prepared the harvest. Thus the field through which Persephone walked was not merely landscape. It was the image of a world still whole, where life knew no fracture, where light believed it might remain forever upon the earth. Yet in Greek myth, the most beautiful things often carry within them an unspoken stillness. Amid the blossoming meadow, amid the spreading light, an unseen fracture had already passed quietly through the world. That moment came not with the noise of chaos, but with the cold, deep movement of fate. From beneath the earth, Hades emerged and took Persephone from the flowering field, carrying her down into the underworld, where light no longer held its form and sound seemed to sink before it could fully rise. This separation was not merely the will of the Lord of the Dead. Behind it lay the consent of a greater order, so that Persephone's loss bore the weight of a decision placed into the world before Demeter or even Persephone herself could know it. From that moment, earth and underworld stood as opposing breaths. Above lay wind, grass, the subtle trembling of growing life. Below lay depth, darkness, a stillness so complete that time itself seemed altered. Hades did not come as a storm. He bore the grave silence of a place from which return is not easily made. Thus Persephone's descent was not a violent fall. It was a slow, steady movement, irresistible, like the fading of afternoon from the fields as darkness draws near without a sound. From here, the tale no longer rests within the moment of her disappearance. It opens into a deeper, slower, more enduring sorrow. That sorrow bears the face of Demeter. When her daughter was taken from the earth, Demeter began a search that stretched across land and sea. She passed through regions changing colour beneath her feet, through waters holding dim reflections of the sky, through paths once familiar that now felt estranged in the absence of a single presence. A goddess once bound to abundance, to harvest, to the richness of the world, withdrew into a grief that seemed to dim her very being. Demeter did not erupt in blazing anger. She sank into a quiet loss, deep, persistent, unyielding, the kind that does not tear the world apart in an instant, but slows it until all things move within its weight. In her wandering, she came to Eleusis, leaving there a sacred depth that would echo through Greek tradition. Yet greater still was her silent withdrawal from the labour that sustained the rhythm of the earth. When the goddess of harvest ceased to touch the fields, fertility did not vanish from a single land, it withdrew from the very foundation of human life. Seeds lay in the soil as though they had forgotten how to rise. Fields no longer answered the light. Wheat ceased to grow. Grass lost its softness. Thus Demeter's sorrow did not remain within a mother's heart. It descended into the fields, into the grain, into the hands of those who sowed, spreading like a season of grief across the world. Loss became climate. The earth that once opened in fullness grew barren in silence. Seeds lay unmoving beneath the cold soil. Harvests failed. Humanity faced famine not merely as a misfortune, but as the direct consequence of a divine wound left unhealed. Nature did not cry out. It simply stopped. The fields did not die with noise. They held their breath, as though waiting for a familiar name to return from a distant depth. The quiet sorrow of the tale lies there. A private grief became no longer private. It became the dryness of the land, the fading of colour across the plains, the absence that all could feel though none could see. In this myth, loss does not dwell in tears. It lives in soil that bears no fruit, in fields without fragrance, in light that falls without meeting life to answer it. Yet Greek myth seldom leaves the world fixed in a single state. Between grief and barrenness, a reconciliation began to take shape, not to erase sorrow, but to give it a form that could return with time. At last, Zeus was compelled to intervene. If Demeter held the earth in barrenness, humankind would perish, and the offerings from the mortal world would cease. Hermes was sent down to the underworld bearing the call of return, and from this arose an accord set between realms. Persephone would return to her mother upon the earth for part of the year. Yet because she had eaten the seeds of the pomegranate, her bond to the underworld could not be wholly severed. She could not remain forever in the light, nor could she vanish forever into darkness. Here, the tale finds its most enduring shape. The fracture is not mended so that all returns as before. The former world had already closed in the moment Persephone was taken. What followed was a new order, where reunion carries limits and joy bears the memory of separation. Persephone lives part of the year with Demeter upon the earth and part with Hades below. Thus the myth does not deny loss. It gives loss a cycle, so that sorrow is no longer sudden calamity, but the familiar rhythm of the world. From that time, the year turned in a form humanity could read in its own fields. When Persephone returned, Demeter opened her heart to the earth once more. Plants rose, wheat grew, and the fields received light as though answering an ancient call. The seasons of blooming and growth became bound to her presence above. When Persephone descended again, Demeter fell back into longing, and the earth grew sparse, cold, and still, as though holding half its light in waiting. Thus the cycle of seasons in Greek thought is not merely the change of weather. It is the story of loss and return, of hands that part and find one another again for a limited time. Persephone is not only a maiden taken below, she is the descent and ascent of nature itself. Demeter is not only a grieving mother, she is the memory of the earth for what has been lost. Hades is not only the ruler of the dead, he is the quiet depth beneath all life, reminding that no flower blooms untouched by shadow. Here the tale comes to rest with a feeling both ancient and deeply human. The world does not move in a straight path toward light alone. It turns through bloom, through absence, through waiting, and back again. Some things cannot be held forever. Some can only be loved in their coming and going. Perhaps that is why the earth still greens and falls quiet each year, as though remembering an old story of a mother, a daughter, and a fragile promise between light and darkness. Heracles did not enter the world as a child welcomed in peace, but as a living mark of a fracture among the gods. He was the son of Zeus and Alcmene, carrying within him a bloodline both noble and burdensome, for even before he had achieved any great deed, his life had already been set between two opposing forces. On one side stood the power of Zeus, vast as the sky, always capable of casting its shadow over every fate. On the other was the quiet yet enduring wrath of Hera, not a single flash of lightning, but a winter that refused to end. And so Heracles grew beneath a destiny far removed from the familiar image of a hero. He did not step into life-seeking glory. He stepped into it as one already marked, as though a weight had been placed upon his shoulders before it had ever been named. If one looks closely at the roots of this story, what first appears is not the clash of weapons nor the gates of triumph, but a heavy and unhurried atmosphere, where the greater the strength, the longer the shadow it casts. Heracles bore within him a power beyond human limits, yet that very gift could not free him from the darkness cast down from the divine. Some lives begin with opportunity, his began with hostility. Some destinies seek out trials to prove themselves. His seemed to have been chosen by trial long before he could call for it. The tragedy, therefore, did not arrive as a visible confrontation upon a battlefield. It unfolded from within, in a place where the strength of the arm could not save the mind. The madness sent by Hera shattered the order of Heracles' life, not through defeat by beast or enemy, but through a catastrophe within his own home. In that frenzy, he slew Megara and his children, and when the blindness lifted, What remained was neither victory nor honour, but the cold emptiness of what could never be undone. From that moment on, Heracles was no longer merely a man who could subdue the world outside. He became one who must live on with a wound of the soul that would never fully close. It is here that his journey changed its nature. What followed was no longer a series of triumphs to build a monument. It became a path of atonement, long as a road with no visible end. His pain did not take the form of lingering battle, but of memory. It followed him like a silent shadow, like a fine ash settling over every glory that came after. He did not seek reward. He did not chase praise. What he sought, if it could be named at all, was only a way to continue existing in a world where he had lost what was most sacred in his life. And so he came to Delphi, where the questions of men are set before an order deeper and colder than themselves. There, the path opened not through comfort, but command. Heracles was to serve Eurystheus, the king tied to Mycenae or Tiryns in different traditions, and accept a sequence of tasks that resembled punishment more than honour. Eurystheus did not stand before him as an equal adversary. He possessed neither the strength of a lion nor the force of a storm. What he held was authority, the voice that defines obligation, the power to compel a stronger man to keep moving forward. From that point, Heracles' life took on a different tone. His strength remained, but it was bound within a colder frame. At first there were 10 labours, then they became 12, for some were not counted in full. That single detail reveals the nature of the journey. It did not move like a reward granted after effort. It moved like a debt that recedes each time one believes it has been reached. One burden lifted, another appears. One land crossed, another horizon opens. And so Heracles began to walk, not toward a single destination, but across a vast world, testing how much a man can endure before he is undone. Those paths stretched outward like a map ever unfolding. In Nemea, a lion with a hide nearly impossible to pierce, a symbol of raw and closed strength, stood as the first wall before him. In Lerna, the Hydra rose from the marsh, many-headed, many-wounded, as though every attempt to end suffering only gave rise to another form of it. Arcadia revealed its deep forests, where the Ceryneian hind and the Erymanthian boar drew the pursuit into rough and unyielding terrain. The stables of Argaeus became another kind of trial, where filth and flowing water forced strength to learn patience. The lake of Stymphalus opened with its deadly birds circling like dark arrows in the air. Crete, Thrace, the land of the Amazons, the far western realm of Geryon, the garden of the Hesperides, and finally the descent into the underworld all followed one another in a chain of distant and relentless horizons. Each land seemed to carry its own law, its own darkness, its own resistance. Some were forests, others marshes, others the domains of strange beings, and some lay near the edge of the world itself, where the familiar thinned and what appeared could no longer be explained by mortal understanding. The story, then, no longer turned on how strong Heracles was. It slowly became a question of how far he must still go, how much weariness he must bear, how many limits he must reach before the debt of his life would begin to settle. It is there that the true nature of the 12 labours emerges. They may be remembered as a list of great feats: the Nemean lion, the Hydra, the hind, the boar, the stables of Argaeus, the Stymphalian birds, the bull of Crete, the mares of Diomedes, the belt of Hippolyta, the cattle of Geryon, the apples of the Hesperides, the hounds Cerberus drawn up from the realm of the dead. But to see them only as separate victories makes the story too bright, too clean, too simple. The truth is heavier than that. Each task followed the last like a relentless tide, allowing no true rest in the life of Heracles. For each labour forced him into a different limit, the limit of strength in grappling with creatures nearly invulnerable, the limit of distance in pursuing what lay always beyond reach, the limit of cunning where what must be taken is guarded by ancient laws, the limit of spirit in descending into the underworld where darkness is no longer metaphor but air, ground, silence, gate, and gaze. Thus Heracles was not only strong, he was one who continued when the next task was no lighter than the last, who lifted himself from exhaustion when nothing ahead promised gentleness. Endurance became the thread that bound everything together. Strength opened the way. Endurance kept the step from breaking. The farther he went, the less he resembled a victor gathering spoils. He became a man quietly carrying the consequences of his life across each land. Eurystheus stood at the end of those journeys like the shadow of obligation, fearful of Heracles yet still able to command him. That presence gave the entire sequence a cold and imposed quality. Far from the noble spirit of chivalry, Heracles did not choose his path of atonement. He accepted a structure in which one weaker than himself could still bind him. Behind that shadow lay another, deeper still. Hera, the first cause of the tragedy, a hand not always seen yet never truly withdrawn. And so in every trial, Heracles faced not only beasts, distant realms, or gates leading downward, but the combined weight of duty and memory, of present command and past guilt. One compelled him forward. The other refused to let him forget why he must go on. That tension gave the journey a somber depth beyond any ordinary adventure. It was not the journey of a man seeking the world. It was the journey of a man carrying his own darkness. And after all, after beasts, after distant borders, after the garden at the edge of the last legends, after even the descent where Cerberus guarded the threshold between life and death, Heracles completed his labours. This may be called completion, but that is not enough. For what truly occurred was more than the closing of 12 tasks. A deeper transformation had taken place. From a man who had wrought an unerasable tragedy, Heracles became one who passed through suffering by labour, by endurance, by long years without any shorter path, and slowly moved beyond the limits of mortality toward immortality. Yet that immortality did not appear as a blazing torch of victory. It was more like a late evening after a long journey, when the wind has stilled, the dust has settled, and a body is finally allowed to lay down the debt it has carried too long. What remains after Heracles is not only the echo of strength or feats, it is the sense of a man who walked the full length of his atonement slow, heavy, enduring, nearly spent, yet never turning away from what had to be borne. In a world of gods, curses, and repeating cycles, that may be the deepest form of strength, not the power to conquer all things, but the power to continue until the darkness within one's own life no longer demands its due. Perseus did not step into the world as one seeking glory, but as one set in motion by unseen forces long prepared. His story begins in Argos, where a prophecy drove King Acrisius to such fear that he locked his own daughter, Danae, away in a sealed chamber to deny fate. Yet light finds its way, and through her union with Zeus, Perseus was born, a life no wall could contain. Acrisius did not kill the child. Instead, he placed mother and son within a wooden chest and cast them upon the sea, leaving their fate to the waves. The chest drifted across the wide waters of the Aegean until it reached the island of Seriphus, where a fisherman drew it from the sea as though retrieving something long forgotten. Perseus grew there, not in a palace, not in power, but in a quiet life, where the shadow of the past followed without ever being named. But the world does not preserve such stillness for long. Polydectes, the king of the island, looked upon Danae with an intention that needed no voice. Perseus became an obstacle, and so a promise was shaped into a trap, a feast, a request that seemed harmless, and then a task that could not be refused. The head of Medusa, he accepted, not for fame, not for challenge, but for something simpler and heavier, to protect the one who had given him life. From that moment, the journey took on another tone, not the stride of a confident hero, but the careful movement of one advancing toward what he could not yet fully understand. Not strength against strength, but a near silent approach to the deepest fear the Greek imagination had ever given form. The path did not open before him at once. It led downward into a deeper layer, where no man reaches horror without the leave of higher powers. Athena appeared, not as a blinding light, but as something clear and cold. Hermes came as motion swift, light, almost without trace. From then on, Perseus did not walk alone, but was guided across the intersections between mortal and divine. The Gaia, aged and sharing a single eye, held a form of knowledge not easily given. From them, the way was revealed, not wholly clear, but enough to continue. What came to him were not the weapons of a warrior, but the pieces of a design. Winged sandals to lift his steps from the ground, a helm of invisibility to cloak him in absence, a curved blade reflecting the dim light of the outer world, an empty pouch waiting for something not yet within it, and the shield. Its surface did not take in light, but returned it. It did not halt the world, but let it continue in another form. Perseus did not become stronger than the darkness. He carried only enough light not to be consumed by it. Only when all was set in place did he move toward the edge of the known world, where the ground no longer felt familiar and the air seemed to move to a different rhythm. There, Medusa existed not merely as a creature, but as the point where fear took its clearest shape. Her cave was not loud, it did not move. The scattered stone forms were not landscape, but memory moments that had stopped. Bodies that had once walked, breathed, lived, now remained as silent marks in space. Medusa lay at the center. Her hair moved without rest, each strand alive with its own motion, and her face needed no expression to become something that could not be faced. Her gaze did not destroy. It halted, it held. It turned all things motionless in the very instant of their being. Fear here did not come as an attack, it came as complete stillness. Perseus could not look, not for lack of courage, but because there are things which, if seen directly, allow no movement to remain. So he did not confront. He adjusted. The shield was raised, not as a barrier, but as a surface like metal water. where an image could exist without being touched. Medusa appeared within it, not direct, not whole, but enough to be known. That distance was everything. Each step was held slow, the air thickened. All things seemed drawn into a single motion. The blade fell in a moment without sound, without eruption, only with a precision that felt long determined. Medusa was no more, but her gaze remained. The head was placed within the pouch, not as a trophy, but as something not meant to be held too long. Perseus left that place without haste, carrying with him a part of the fear he had never faced directly. Returning to Seriphus, the world had not changed, but the order within it had shifted. Polydectes remained, along with the eyes that had once dismissed a forced promise. Perseus spoke little. The pouch was opened, and this time, that gaze was no longer a threat. It became an ending. What had once stilled life was now used to close an old injustice. Afterward, the head was given away, not kept, not claimed. Athena received it and set it upon her shield as a sign that needed no explanation. Fear did not vanish. It changed its place. There are things that cannot be overcome by facing them too soon. They require distance, reflection, a knowing that keeps one from being drawn into one's own gaze. Perseus did not triumph by being stronger than fear. He learned only how not to let it define the way he saw the world. And in another story, in another place, a path will no longer lead straight to a monster, but will bend within a labyrinth, where danger lies not in a gaze, but in the very shape of the path itself. On the island of Crete, under the rule of King Minos, there stood a structure like an unhealed wound, a deep and sealed labyrinth raised to confine a being that did not belong to the world of men. Within it, the Minotaur lived and waited, not in bursts of rage, but within a steady cycle of sacrifice, where youths from Athens were sent as an offering repeated through the years. Time did not break that cycle. It only made it familiar, heavy, and harder to escape. Theseus, son of Aegeus, entered the story not as one who sought glory, but as one who accepted a path already marked for death. He went with those chosen, not setting himself apart from their shared fate, as though he understood that to end a cycle, one must step into its very centre. The ship left Athens without cheers, carrying only a long silence, where each wave seemed to echo a question without answer. Crete appeared not as a battlefield, but as a space long arranged, where power and secrecy coexisted within layers of stone and corridors without light. The labyrinth was not merely a prison for a monster, but a design meant to strip men of direction, to erase the memory of an exit, and at last to dissolve the self. Before he entered, another presence emerged, light, almost without disturbing the air. Ariadne, daughter of Minos, saw in Theseus not merely a man, but the possibility of change where something had endured too long. She spoke little, caused no great disturbance, only placed in her hand a slender thread, small enough to be overlooked, yet strong enough to hold a path. That thread did more than mark the way. It preserved a connection, a memory of the outside, something that did not belong to those repeating walls. In a place where every turn was alike, where every corridor led toward confusion, the one thing that kept a man from vanishing was the memory of where he had first entered. Ariadne did not change the labyrinth, but she gave Theseus a way not to be changed by it. Once he crossed the threshold, the world behind him closed almost at once. Light dimmed, sound withdrew, and space began to repeat itself in curves and walls without distinction. Each footstep rang and faded, as though absorbed by the structure itself. Time no longer moved in a clear direction, but circled within a single, slow rhythm. The labyrinth did not hasten death, it delayed it. It stretched the path, made it more tangled, more elusive. Each turn was a choice, each choice a chance for error, and each error a step deeper into a place without a clear end. The monster did not need to appear at once. The descent itself was already a trial. At the heart of that structure, the Minotaur existed as a gathering of what had been hidden. Half man, half beast, it belonged to no complete order, but lingered at the boundary between reason and instinct. It did not need to roam, for the labyrinth itself drew all things nearer in time. It was the reason the labyrinth existed, and yet also what gave the labyrinth its own slow, heavy breath. Theseus did not rush. He walked, paused, listened, and walked again. Behind him, the thread stretched in quiet tension, a thin line keeping him from drifting fully into the repetition around him. When the Minotaur finally appeared, it came not like a storm, but like a presence long waiting, close, heavy, and unavoidable. Their encounter unfolded in a space without witness, without clear light, held only by breath, by footsteps, and by a distance steadily closing. Theseus did not fight to prove anything, but to pass beyond a point where stopping meant there would be no return. When the Minotaur fell, it did not resound loudly. It was only a slight change in the air, as though a breath had ceased. But the labyrinth remained. Victory did not open the way out. It only made the way out necessary. Theseus turned back, following the thread that had remained from the moment he entered. Each step back was not a repetition, but a reversal, where what once caused confusion could now be recognized. Light did not come at once, but its presence could be felt from afar, like something that had always existed and still waited ahead. When Theseus emerged, he carried not only victory but himself, intact. The Minotaur was gone, yet what mattered more was that the labyrinth had not kept him. Ariadne's thread had not merely guided him, it had kept him from vanishing within a structure built to do just that. There are journeys that do not end at the moment one faces what is most fearsome. They end where a man still remembers the way back. Jason set forth not merely to seek a sacred object hanging at the far edge of the horizon, but to reclaim what should have been his from the beginning. He was the son of Aeson, the rightful king of Iolcos, a land by the Thessalian shore where power once bore a name, a lineage, a clear order. Yet that throne had been taken by Peleus, his half-uncle, as though a branch were broken from its tree before dawn had fully come. When Jason returned as a man, what awaited him was not the restoration of justice, but a cold condition. Peleus promised to yield the throne if Jason could bring back from Colchis the golden fleece, a sacred relic lying far to the east, beyond the Black Sea, in the sacred grove of Ares. Thus the journey began not from a hunger for adventure, nor from dreams of conquering the sea, but from a fracture within both family and kingship. On land, he had no firm ground left. At sea, his only hope drifted somewhere nearly beyond reach. The golden fleece carried an older tale, one that began with Phrixus and the golden ram that bore him from death, and ended in Colchis, where its fleece was hung as a sign of divine favour, guarded day and night by a sleepless dragon. From the outset, Jason's journey bore two faces. On the surface, it was a quest for treasure. Beneath, it was a winding return, where a man sought his homeland by first going far from it. From that moment, the path no longer ran straight from Iolcos to Colchis. It widened into a long voyage, where the sea became an open space binding together many fates, many oaths, many longings that could not stand upon a single shore. Jason did not sail alone. Around him gathered young and renowned heroes, forming the company later called the Argonauts, those who journeyed aboard the ship Argo. Nearly 50 men stepped upon that wooden deck, each bearing a name, a strength, a fragment of destiny. Among them were figures whose names would echo again through Greek myth, such as Castor and Polydeuces, men who not only sailed with Jason, but helped turn that vessel into a small world adrift between waves and legend. Argo was therefore not merely a means to cross the sea. It was like a fragile moving home upon the waters, where heroic steps had to learn to fall into a single rhythm of oars, a single direction of wind, a single enduring patience. By day, the ship passed across vast, shoreless blue. By night, it rested beneath a sky thick with stars, a small dark point within boundless silence. At times the sea lay calm, as though asleep. At others it deepened and darkened, as though holding something unspoken since the world's first beginning. The goal remained ahead, yet the living breath of the tale lay in brief landings, in arrivals and departures, in shores that left only an echo before fading behind. The path was not continuous. It broke into harbours, into errors, into trials, into guidance that could only be received after one had already passed through a portion of one's own shadow. The Argonauts came to Lemnos, an island like a pause rising from the sea, where the journey slowed for a moment before opening again. From there they reached the land of the Doliones, where hospitality seemed to grant them rest. Yet the sea does not hold peace for long. A storm drove them back by night. The wind shifted, darkness veiled all faces, and those who had welcomed them no longer knew them. A battle rose from confusion, cold and sorrowful as a misplaced dream. At dawn, Jason learned that his own hand had slain King Sickle, who the day before had opened his gates to them. Some tragedies are not born of hatred, but of blindness in the dark. For that reason, they leave a deeper sorrow. Beyond Doliones lay Bebryces, and more long stretches of water, and distant shores appearing and fading like memory. Then they came to Phineus, the blind king tormented endlessly by the Harpies. Here the journey shifted for a moment. Strength alone was no longer enough. Aid was given in exchange for knowledge. When the Argonauts freed Phineus from his ceaseless torment, they received something greater than weapons, guidance to pass the Symplegades, the clashing rocks that struck together like the jaws of the sea itself. That gate could not be crossed by reckless force. It required rhythm, patience, and a moment of precision nearly impossible to grasp. Thus each passage upon the sea was no mere aside to the quest. It was what gave the quest its breath, its depth, its soul. After long waters and foreign shores, Colchis at last appeared, as though a name long spoken in stories had taken form. Yet at the place toward which the whole journey had been drawn, the true gate still remained closed. In Colchis, Jason met Eets, the king who held the Golden Fleece. He had reached the farthest point of his voyage, yet to arrive was never the same as to possess. Eets did not yield the treasure. Instead, he set before Jason tasks nearly impossible to complete in a single day. He must subdue fire-breathing bulls of bronze, yoke them to plough a field, and then sow dragon's teeth, from which armed warriors would rise from the earth like a harvest of war. The sea was now behind him, yet the sense of drifting remained. On this distant land, Jason was still as one not fully arrived. Colchis revealed a familiar truth of Greek myth. The destination is not the end. It is where the trial changes form and begins again under another name. While that gate remained shut, another figure entered the tale, like a wind-bending fate in a different direction. Medea, daughter of Eetes, princess of Colchis, bore within her the knowledge of enchantment and the secrets the land had kept longer than any ship had sailed. She had not departed from Iolcos, had not stood upon Argo from the beginning, yet she became the bridge between Jason and the impossible. Medea aided him in ways strength alone never could. She prepared an ointment to shield his flesh from the fire of the bronze bulls. She taught him how to face the warriors sprung from dragon's teeth, turning them against one another in the chaos of their own rising. She opened paths through the unseen walls of Colchis and led him nearer to the treasure guarded like the sacred heart of the land. Jason's success was not built upon will alone. It was woven from bonds, from aid, from the devotion of one who chose to stand beside him. That gave the tale a gentler depth, yet also a greater sorrow. For even then, the cost of victory had begun to take shape, to bring Jason to what he sought. Medea would have to leave her homeland, her family, and the world that had named her princess. Through Medea, the final goal at last came within reach. Yet the thing hanging upon that sacred oak was still guarded by a creature that never slept. The golden fleece hung upon the tree in the grove of Ares, gleaming through the leaves like a fragment of light caught from the age when gods walked nearer the earth. Beneath it, the dragon coiled like a circle of night that never closed. Jason could not claim it by mortal strength alone. Once more, Medea became the key. With spells and herbs, she lulled the dragon into sleep, easing the ancient vigilance of the grove for a fleeting moment. Only then did Jason step forward, take the fleece, and bear it back to the ship. That moment required no great cry. After the long voyage, the many harbours, the errors, the trials, the sought-for object was finally in hand. Yet the sea still lay ahead. The future was not yet calm. The outward success was real. Jason had taken the treasure and fulfilled the condition once set in Iolcos. But that success cast a long shadow. Upon returning, Medea would stain her hands with the death of Peleus. Then she and Jason would be forced to flee, and in time, Jason would abandon her for another marriage, turning a tale that began in aid and companionship into a tragedy more enduring than the voyage itself. Thus the Golden Fleece was not merely a reward at the end of the path. It was something taken down together with a debt bound tightly to it. Jason had touched what he sought to reclaim, yet from that very moment, fate had already begun preparing its answer. If the voyage of Argo was a long road upon the sea, where each harbour gathered into destiny, then beyond another horizon, a greater trial was waiting for the Greek world, no longer the journey of a single ship, but the long years of war encircling Troy. where time would wear both glory and loss into the same quiet dust. The Trojan War did not begin with the clash of bronze upon the battlefield, nor did it rise from an army drawn in ranks beneath its banners. It began with something far quieter, almost private, almost gentle, yet enough to tilt the balance of the Greek world itself. Paris, Prince of Troy, carried Helen away from Sparta, taking with him not only a woman famed for her beauty, but a fracture that cut through honour, marriage, and the oaths once sworn between kingdoms. Helen was the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, and so her departure was no longer the story of a single heart. It became an affront capable of shaking many thrones at once. From that moment, a choice between two people widened into a calamity for many city-states. Old oaths, thought long buried in the past, stirred again like currents beneath the sea. The kings of Greece gathered their forces not only to reclaim Helen, but to preserve what they believed to be the order between men, between kings and their word, between honour and power. Some wars are born of ambition, some are born of fear. This war, at its beginning, was born of a separation that seemed confined to palace walls. Yet it is often such private fractures that turn the course of history more swiftly than armies ever could. And so the story left the walls of Sparta, crossed the Aegean, and unfolded beneath the skies of Anatolia upon the shore where Greek ships made landfall, and before the towering walls of Troy, where time would no longer move as it once had. Troy rises in epic memory as a city both near and distant, both radiant and veiled in mist. Within its walls stood the house of Priam Helen, Paris, Hector, Andromache, its corridors echoing with footsteps of waiting and unease. Beyond those walls lay the Greek encampment, long rows of ships along the shore. Dust, bronze shields, spears, summers burning beneath harsh suns, winters returning with weariness. This war didn't flare and end in a single decisive clash. It stretched from year to year, until its very length became a kind of fate. Troy was not besieged by enemies alone. It was besieged by time. Each passing day laid another layer of dust upon its walls, another silence within the hearts of those who endured. Each battle opened and closed without ending all things. War, in this way, ceased to be an event. It became a condition of living, a state in which men woke to war, waited within war, aged in war, and died while war still refused to leave the sky above them. Amid such drawn-out conflict, the central figures were not merely renowned warriors, they were reflections of different kinds of fate, mirroring one another like fragments of a shattered tragedy. Paris was the beginning of the upheaval, yet not its soul. He was like the hand that first tugged at a thread, unravelling the whole fabric of destiny. In him were beauty, desire, and a choice that altered the course of Troy. Helen, at the centre of it all, became the image of something both desired and blamed. Many gazed upon her, yet few truly saw her. Within her fate, longing, regret, pride, and accusation were bound together as though the war itself needed a face upon which to cast all its uncertainty. Achilles stood at the opposite extreme. He was force almost beyond resistance, a fury forged into human form, a fierce awareness of honour and insult. Each step he took upon the battlefield was like thunder before something would break. Hector was his counterpart. He did not rise from rage, but from duty. In him lived the son, the husband, the father, the defender of the city, one who bore not only his own life, but the heartbeat of Troy itself. If Achilles was a flame that burned high and wild, Hector was a pillar standing long against the wind, one consumed, one preserved, one rushed toward glory, one remained for duty. It was this opposition that made the war more painful than any ordinary struggle, for at its heart stood men who were anything but small. Years of siege passed. At some point, the war ceased to ask who was right or wrong. It became a question of who could endure longer. The greatest names of the heroic age entered the conflict, thickening and burdening the battlefield beyond return. Agamemnon, Menelaus, Odysseus, Ajax, Achilles on the Greek side, Priam, Hector, Paris, Aeneas, and their allies within Troy. Yet the more heroes appeared, the less the air seemed to clear. It only grew heavier, like the stillness before a storm that had lingered too long. Even among the Greeks, pride and wounded honour bred division. The rift between Achilles and Agamemnon weakened their strength by their own hands. Patroclus fell. Troy seemed at times ready to rise again, only to be driven back into shadow. The war moved like the tide, rising and falling, brightening and darkening, yet never truly receding. It was as though all could see the tragedy gathering like a dark cloud, yet none remained free enough to step beyond its shadow. And then, within that long war, came a moment that became the most painful centre of the entire myth: Achilles against Hector. After the death of Patroclus, Achilles' rage was no longer a fire held within. It became a force that tore through all remaining limits. He returned to battle, his grief sharpened into a blade, pursuing Hector around the walls of Troy as though fate itself were circling before its end. When Hector fell, what was lost was not only Troy's greatest warrior, it was as though the city's very heartbeat had been torn from its chest. The tragedy lay in this: the moment brought no peace to the victor. Achilles did not emerge as one who had found rest. Hector's death carried with it Priam's sorrow, the desecration of the body, and the shadow already closing over Achilles' own fate. What began with Helen had now been driven to a place where the noblest of both sides were crushed beneath the wheel of destruction. War, when it endures too long, no longer preserves its original cause. It becomes its own reason to continue. Yet even with Hector fallen, the tragedy did not end. It merely changed its form. After years of bloodshed in open battle, Troy's final fall came not in blazing daylight, but in the cold of night, from something that seemed a gift, from a hollow wooden horse brought within the city. Here, victory no longer bore the shape of open strength, but of patience, deception, and quiet infiltration. Troy did not fall because its walls were shattered in battle. It fell because its gates opened to what appeared most harmless. It was the final cut of the war, colder than any spear, quieter than any horn. When that night closed, the city that had stood through years of siege sank into flame. Houses dissolved into smoke. Families broke apart in cries of loss. Streets once trodden by kings and warriors reflected only ash. That ending revealed the nature of the war itself. After years of attrition, Troy was not defeated by a moment of heroism, but by exhaustion grown so deep it could no longer guard against even the smallest threat. It was not a radiant victory. It was the end of a tragedy drawn out so long that even its final light could only fall upon dust. Troy fell. From without, it might be said the Greeks achieved what they sought, but within the echoes that remained, the victory was never whole. Many returned no longer as they had been. Many did not return at all. Many homes were shattered among the defeated, yet the houses of the victors found no true peace. The sea still awaited wandering. The gods still held debts unpaid. Time continued its cold work, carrying the consequences of Troy far from the cooling ash. Paris had Helen, yet lost his city. Helen returned, yet could not turn time back to before her leaving Sparta. Achilles had glory, yet his fate was already closing. Hector kept his honour, yet could not keep Troy. The city that had stood through seasons of sea winds and years of siege still fell at last into fire like all things beautiful, yet finite. A war that began in desire and honour ended in ash. That is why it should not be remembered as a song of victory, but as a long memory of erosion of men, of cities, of the belief that after so much loss, anything might remain untouched. From the ashes of Troy, the journey of the mythic world did not end. One man who survived the war would carry its echo across the sea, through distant islands, through years of wandering not yet closed. His name was Odysseus. Odysseus left Troy with a wish so simple it hardly needed to be spoken. He wished to return to Ithaca, to the home left behind years before, to Penelope, to Telemachus, to the small island that had once been the centre of his life before war carried him beyond the far edge of youth. Yet the path before his prow was not a short stretch of water from one shore to another. It was a span of 10 years, so long that the distance between departure and return was no longer merely geography, but the weight of another life laid in between. Troy had fallen, its fires extinguished upon walls that once rang with bronze and spear, but for Odysseus, the war did not truly end there. It only changed its shape. The clash of metal faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of water against the hull. The dust of battle gave way to dim horizons, where sea and sky met like two halves of an endless dream. Each wind carried him farther from Troy, yet stretched the road home ever longer, as though fate would not allow one who had passed through war to return unchanged, or too soon. And so this journey bore none of the eagerness of a voyage toward glory. It carried instead the quiet weariness of one who had wandered too long through the upheavals of the world. The ship left a land consumed by fire, yet the war remained within the body and mind of the man who sailed away. Some wars end in treaties, some end in ash. Others continue to live in the years that follow quieter, slower, deeper. For Odysseus, the sea itself became the new form of that lingering echo. From there, the story no longer belonged to the land. It gave itself to the water, drifting through places where the map of men grew thin, like fabric faded by salt and mist. His return unfolded among open seas and distant islands, at the edges of the world where myth, nature, and fear touched one another in a strange light. Island after island, harbour after harbour, his path became an unending chain of delay. Some places rose in stone and wind, others in scent, in enchantment, in song. Some stood like shadows upon the vast water. The sea here was not merely the space between beginning and end. It was the measure of waiting. It stretched time thin and long, so that each day adrift bore the weight of many. Ithaca remained yet with every foreign shore. It grew more like a distant memory at the edge of sight. Among these drifting years, one of the earliest and deepest trials came in the encounter with the Cyclops Polyphemus, the giant son of Poseidon. Odysseus and his men entered the cave as though stepping into another world where the laws of men no longer held. There was no hospitality, no order, no gentle bounds of civilization, only stone, darkness, the heavy breath of a vast being, and the sense that men had strayed too far into a place not meant for them. Within that darkness, cunning faced brute force not as a clean triumph, but as the first lesson in the cost of survival. Odysseus escaped by wit, by a plan sharp enough to carve a path through despair, but escape brought no peace. It revealed something colder still. Scarcely had he left one war than he entered another trial, and from that was cast onward again. From here, the journey showed its true face, not a straight road home, but a cycle of entrapment and escape, repeating like waves against stone. Yet not all dangers came in violence. Some were softer, therefore harder to resist. One of the most beautiful and sorrowful halts came upon the island of Aeaea, home of Circe. There, enchantment did not strike like a blade, but settled like a gentle mist upon time itself. His companions were transformed by her magic, and he himself endured only through divine aid. Yet what lingered was not merely the event, but the sense that time had slowed, softened, no longer flowing as before. Circe was not merely an obstacle. She was the embodiment of seductive delay of resistance without storm or stone. Upon that island, men could forget their purpose, forget the way home, forget that somewhere beyond lay Ithaca waiting. Some things halt the journey through pain, others through comfort. The latter are often more perilous, for they do not frighten, they invite one to remain a little longer, and then a little longer still, until years pass without a sound. Leaving Circe, Odysseus sailed on, drifting again across uncertain waters. Yet the sea did not test men only with storm or beast. Sometimes it tested them with sound. The sirens appeared not as force, but as song. Their voices did not tear the air, they softened it, bend in direction itself, drawing the will away from home toward some sweeter shore. Odysseus, knowing this, stopped his crew's ears with wax, while he himself was bound to the mast so that he might hear, yet not yield. It is a strange, beautiful, sorrowful image, a man who longs to hear what is most alluring, yet knows that to be free before, it would mean losing his way forever. The sirens are not merely creatures of myth. They are the embodiment of every longing that can draw a man away from his path. After years adrift, what is most dangerous is not always death, but the desire to surrender, to dissolve into a call without end, to forget even the name of the shore that once awaited. Placed beside one another, Cyclops, Circe, sirens, the journey reveals itself not as separate adventures, but as a single, unbroken feeling, landfall, encounter, entrapment, loss, delay, and drift again. Thus the road home stretches, like a thread pulled endlessly between the hands of time. 10 years of war, 10 years of wandering, the life of Odysseus divided between departure and return, and so his homecoming bears the weight of endurance more than conquest. Ithaca remains real, yet after so many distant shores, it becomes almost a dream. Home is a place that exists, and yet survives only in memory. Each time he survives, he does not feel closer, only that he continues a little farther along the path. The burden lies there not in monsters, nor magic, nor song, but in the endless prolonging of the way. And at last, after years that made time itself heavier and slower, the journey came to its end. Odysseus returned to Ithaca not in triumphal cries, nor in the splendour of a conqueror. At first, few even knew him. The homeland had changed in his absence, and he had changed in return. With the aid of Telemachus, he slew the suitors and restored his rule. Yet in truth, he did not return as he had left. 20 years' war and wandering are too long for any man to pass unchanged. He reached his shore, yet the sea remained within him. He entered his home, yet still carried the caves, the islands, the voices soft as mist and sharp as fate. Some journeys end when the feet touch land, others end only upon the map, while their echoes live on within the soul. Thus the deepest meaning of return is not simply to arrive where one once departed, it is to carry what has been lost, what has passed upon the open sea, and learn to live with it beneath the old roof. Odysseus returned, but not as the man who once sailed to Troy. He returned as one who had endured too long a road, who had seen the edges of the world, and yet held fast to a single thread leading home. In Greek myth, to return does not always mean to remain whole. It means only that after all loss, a man still has strength enough to recognize his shore. After Odysseus, the light upon the heroic world begins to fade. Great figures withdraw from the centre, and glories once radiant close slowly, like the sun descending toward evening. From here, the story turns toward quieter ground where splendour no longer expands, but gathers into memory. After the fires of the war at Troy had burned low, the Greek world did not fall at once into silence, yet its resonance had changed. The sea still opened toward the same horizons, the wind still passed over the rocky capes, the city walls still stood beneath the sun, and yet everything seemed to have withdrawn from its former intensity. Once, all great roads appeared drawn toward a single meeting point of fate, where oaths, hatred, honour, and the will of the gods converged into one defining event. Now that convergence had passed, leaving behind an air that was quieter, wider, and yet more sparse, the world had not ceased to move, it simply no longer trembled in the same way. In the pale light that followed upheaval, what remained was neither victory nor loss, but a nameless emptiness, like the memory of a great wave long withdrawn, whose shape still lingered upon the water. From that moment on, the weight of the story no longer rested upon the fate of a single hero, but upon the sense of an entire generation receding from the earth. The names that once upheld that age still endured in the memory of the world: Heracles, Perseus, Theseus, Achilles, Odysseus, each name like a flame that had once burned at the edge of the impossible. They belonged to a time when mortals walked close to what lay beyond the ordinary, when monsters might still rise from dark seas, when prophecy could bend the fate of a kingdom, when a sword, a shield, a ship might carry the will of forces greater than humankind. But now, these names no longer opened new circles of story. They no longer appeared as presences in action, but as markers retreating into distant mist. Heracles was no longer seen amid labours heavy as mountains and long as drought. Achilles no longer blazed beneath the walls, his wrath tilting the course of war. Odysseus no longer drifted among strange shores, between temptation, peril, and a longing for home that stretched like destiny itself. Perseus no longer stood at the threshold between the gaze that turned to stone and the stroke that set free. Theseus no longer ventured deeper into the labyrinth, where each step might be the last. Their presence had changed in nature. From men who walked within the world, they became names spoken again beside the hearth, within songs, within the shared memory of a civilization that knew it had once passed through a fiercer age. Their light had not gone out, yet it no longer shone upon the present. It had begun to shine from the past. As heroes no longer stepped into great quests, the very structure of the world quietly altered its hue. One could feel it most clearly when placing the heroic age beside another rhythm of ancient Greek thought, where attention no longer gathered around deeds that touched the divine, but turned instead toward labour, the seasons, justice, endurance, and the life of ordinary days. This was not merely a change of subject, but a change of sensibility. Once, the world seemed stretched taut by trials beyond all limits. There was always a monster to be struck down, a distant land to be crossed, a curse to be undone, a stronghold to be besieged. The sky seemed higher then, the sea deeper, the darkness filled with more hidden doors. Now those great doors remained in memory, but no longer opened with the same frequency. No voice declared that the age of heroes had ended. No hand drew a curtain before the world. There was only the sense that the boundaries which once called mortals beyond themselves had grown more closed, more silent, less responsive. The world began to narrow its range. Movements once bearing the scale of epic withdrew into the distance, giving way to rhythms tied to harvest, to work, to a quiet persistence less radiant yet more real, closer to the earth. It was a slow withdrawal, not violent, not sudden, like evening lowering the light without a sound. For this reason, the fading of heroes should not be taken as a single event, nor as a closed ending that can be marked and named. It was a collective dimming. The great names still echoed, yet they no longer walked the earth as before. Danger did not vanish. The darker corners of life remained, as did conflict, sorrow, and loss. Yet the structure of the world had changed. What once demanded the strength of a demigod, the courage of a warrior at the edge of legend, or the direct hand of higher powers, now seemed to withdraw into memory, into song, into rites of remembrance. The world didn't bid them farewell. It simply went on, slowly, and almost without turning back, until one day it became clear that such figures no longer appeared as they once had. Within that quietness, a double meaning began to emerge. The world grew less harsh, yet at the same time less wondrous. When great monsters had been driven back, when labyrinths no longer stood at the centre of imagination, when voyages to the edge of the world no longer pressed so close, humankind perhaps entered a safer space. The immense burdens once placed upon heroes seemed to have been resolved, or at least set aside like storms no longer overhead. There was a lightness in this, a sense of ease. The earth became more livable when it no longer awaited, each day, the rise of some creature from the dark to challenge its order. Yet the cost of that ease was a subtle, deep absence. When heroes faded, the world lost a measure of its own brightness. The sea remained vast. yet less often took the form of a path toward the impossible. Mountains still rose high, yet seldom served as steps upon which mortals tested their limits. Darkness endured, yet no longer carried the same depth of mystery. What remained was a world more stable, more enduring, perhaps gentler, yet smaller in imagination. Peace, in this sense, was not the same as richness. Safety did not erase the feeling of the loss. It only softened it, made it harder to name, like the last gold of day withdrawing from a field without a sound. From there, a new condition slowly formed, no longer upheld by those who could carry an age upon their shoulders, but by the ordinary life of humankind. The centre of the world drew closer to the earth, to working hands, to harvest and sowing, to law, fairness, and the tasks repeated each day. People began to exist without assuming that every great crisis would be answered by a demigod, a mighty warrior, or one who could pass through the labyrinth of fate and return victorious. The old stories were still told, the old songs were still remembered, yet the role of the hero had changed. They were no longer those who acted within the world, but those whom the world remembered in order to understand what it had once been. This was not a bitter ending, nor a heavy lament. It was like a slow turning of seasons in the Greek imagination, where the age of those who touched the extraordinary receded, and the world of ordinary mortals began to stand upon its own feet. The sky remained. The sea remained. The cities still cast their shadows upon the same ground. Only the light had changed. Only the distance between humankind and the marvellous had grown slightly wider. From there, absence was no longer merely the absence of heroes, but the first sign that even the gods themselves would one day withdraw from the centre of human experience, leaving the world to learn how to continue within a space that was quieter, emptier, and profoundly human. The world had grown far quieter than in the age when tremors passed through the sky like commands of the divine. No more walls ablaze beneath the weight of destiny. No more roads leading to the edge of dark seas. No more labyrinths sealing terror within stone. No more monsters waiting at the boundary between life and the unnamed. The earth seemed to have learned how to rest beneath the light of morning, the sea to follow its own rhythm of rise and fall, and the sky had become so high and clear that the powers once descending from it now felt like a distant memory. The traces of the gods remained everywhere, but no longer in the direct way they once had. Mountains still stood in ancient silence. Clouds still drifted as though some unseen order governed from above. The sea still opened into depths that reminded mortals of powers beyond their own. Yet the dominant feeling was no longer that someone from the heights might step down to alter the course of fate. That feeling had receded. It had not vanished, only settled, like the last roll of thunder fading slowly across a valley at dusk. Olympus still endured in the memory of a culture that once looked to its peak as the centre of sacred order. Zeus still belonged to the sky, Athena to wisdom, Hades to the depth where all light must one day cease. Yet their dwelling now resembled a distant summit seen through a thin veil of mist, rather than a stage unfolding before the eyes. As the world grew quiet in this way, what remained was no longer action, but distance. That distance revealed itself in the changing voice of story. Once, everything moved to the rhythm of great events. A hero might step forth from the shadow of prophecy. A ship might depart in search of a sacred object at the far edge of unknown seas. a city might gather both glory and ruin within a single age. Now that rhythm thinned, the radiance of the heroic age did not vanish at once, but withdrew like a tide after a long moonlit season, leaving the ground nearer, more real, more still. In such a world, human life came forward more clearly in daily work, in the turning of seasons, in justice, labour, and waiting. Stories did not end, but they no longer continued with the same cadence. No new force arose in constant succession to draw the entire world into trial. No great confrontation compelled every land to bend beneath the fate of a few exalted names. Instead came the sense of order settling, like a great wind past, leaving fields of grain, soil, sweat, and time. This shift of voice allowed the gods to become distant without ever disappearing. No one departed the memory of this world in a sudden gesture. Ancient names retained their full weight in story, in temples, in sculpture, in poetry, in the ways humankind imagined power, beauty, death, wisdom, harvest, and light. Zeus, Athena, Demeter, Apollo. Hades still lived, yet no longer as presences that would intervene at every turn. They existed on another plane, farther, fainter, enduring. Thus Olympus was never empty. It merely receded into the realm of symbol. What had once been presence became inheritance. What had once been action became legend. What had once unfolded in time passed into memory, into art, into language, into the ways humans name their world. A mountain in mist creates such a feeling. It does not vanish from the horizon. It is simply no longer near enough to be touched. From there, it becomes clear that this is not an ending but a transformation. Myth was never only a record of events. From the beginning, it was a way a civilization learned to speak of sky, earth, sea, justice, suffering, beauty, labour, and death. Such a story does not end because the gods no longer appear with the same immediacy. It shifts from something unfolding into something remembered, told, reflected upon, and passed from one generation to the next like a flame that no longer flares high, yet continues to warm its core. There are sounds that do not leave silence when they fade, but resonance. Myth is such a sound. It is no longer the resounding call across a battlefield or from a cliff above the sea. It becomes the echo of a world once close to the sacred. Zeus becomes the idea of power in the high heavens, Athena the image of lucid wisdom and the hand that shapes order, Hades the contemplation of the final depth every life must face. Each god withdraws a little farther, yet in that distance they remain longer, like stars that do not illuminate every face, yet still define the night. As the gods withdraw in this manner, the place of humankind within the world also changes. People begin to live more by their own strength. They sow, they wait, they build, they set laws, they weigh justice, and endure their burdens with finite hands. Life draws nearer to the soil, to rain and sun, to the repeating work of each season. This is not a poorer world, but a more mature one, standing upon itself. Yet standing alone does not mean severing ties with the old stories. Humans still carry them, like an ancient map that has never ceased to matter. These stories help them name fear, imagine beauty, understand order, recognize the fragility of life, and feel themselves part of something greater. Myth does not leave life, it changes its place. From before the eyes, it moves behind them, from action into meaning, from presence into imagination. In the end, what remains is a layering of echoes, gentle and enduring. First, memory. The names once bound to sky, sea, war, harvest, journey, and trial become the long memory of culture. Then, foundation. Ancient symbols continue to nourish literature, art, thought, and the way humans speak of themselves. And finally, a presence no longer visible, not standing before the eyes as in old tales, yet still abiding in language, in symbol, in the deep imaginings through which humanity understands the world. So this is not a final closing. The gods have not truly gone anywhere. They have only withdrawn, grown quieter, more subtle, becoming the ground of the world rather than its brightest flame. Olympus remains. The old stories remain. The ancient names remain. Only now they appear like distant mountains at the edge of the horizon, where the last light lingers before dissolving into mist. The world has grown still. The heroes have receded. The gods, too, have stepped back into the sky of memory. Nothing has truly been lost. Everything has only become lighter, farther, and remains as the ancient foundation of human imagination.